council meetings. For our hard of hearing residents present, we have wireless headsets available through our AV team in the back of the council chambers. Our first item on the agenda is a discussion regarding reimbursement of cancellation fees for residential waste services. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, which I'll ask our staff to summarize.
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, council and community. First up this evening is a face and a name that is going to be easily recognizable to all of us. Although this is her last show, we were talking outside and she said for one night only. She's returning to the podium. Allison Harvey, for those community members and those that are watching online, Allison has now made the transition to become the Deputy Director at Library Arts and History. But she's here joining us tonight because she is the most versed with this topic that we're going to be discussing, residential waste services. With that, Ms. Harvey, thanks for giving up your evening and joining us tonight for this topic. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, council members. I am glad to be here with you tonight. This agenda item responds to council's requests for information about what it could look like to reimburse our community members that have to pay cancellation fees for their current waste services to join the city's new residential program. Essentially a math problem that I'll walk us through later towards the end of the presentation, how many residents are impacted, what we know about the numbers and the fees, the budget impact. We also wanted to take this opportunity to give you a couple of updates about the rollout of the services and some common concerns that we're hearing from residents. Slide, please. Thanks, James. Before we begin, I want to be clear for council and for the public and anyone watching that the numbers we're going to walk you through tonight don't match what's in the memo. And that is because when we wrote the memo and finalized it, we knew that Republic Services had a cart removal fee. They had not yet confirmed their plans related to that fee when we finalized the memo, but they have since confirmed to staff that they will be issuing a credit to any Brimfield customers who are canceling Republic Services because they need to join the city's program. So if you are a Republic customer and you have already canceled your services, you need to call them to get that credit sorted out. But we wanted you to have the most up-to-date budget impact numbers, and that's what we'll present in the slides. Slide, please. There we go. In case anyone is watching who hasn't been following this story, the program that we're talking about tonight is part of a plan of strategies to reach the city's waste diversion goals that were set back in 2020. And having a contracted residential waste program was one of the highest impact strategies recommended in the zero waste plan. So council had directed staff to go through a formal competitive solicitation process at the end of 2023. And after 6 proposals were received and reviewed, Waste Connections of Colorado was selected and staff negotiated an agreement with the company. It was just 5 months ago or so that we were here with that agreement in the ordinance that council passed to establish the program and enter this 5-year agreement with Waste Connections. And since then, Brimfield and Waste Connections staff have been working flat out with support from EcoCycle to make sure that the rollout of these services goes as smoothly as possible for our community. Slide, please. Thanks. As a reminder, the people who are participating in this program are residents of single-family homes and multifamily unit complexes with 7 or fewer units, that never gets easier to say, who don't live in an HOA with contracted trash and recycling services. It's about 9,600 households for Brimfield, and these folks are automatically enrolled to the program unless they choose to opt out and pay the $10.50 monthly minimum service fee. And we've heard that many of these are having to pay a cancellation fee to do this, and that's what brings us here tonight. The next steps in this program are that cart deployment is happening between March 17th and 28th. So that for the residents who didn't opt out already, so that services can begin on March 31st, which is just next month. So it's been a quick time getting to us here. And one of the reasons behind choosing Waste Connections was that they were able to turn around and begin implementing pretty quickly. Residents can expect to receive a welcome packet in the beginning of March prior to cart deployment. And this will let them know the route map, the service days, what they can expect, what's recyclable, information about senior and military discounts. Just as a reminder for anyone who's listening, seniors and active military and veterans get a 10% discount, but they do have to contact Waste Connections to get that discount. Cart delivery. Residents will not know what day their carts are going to be delivered. It depends a lot on weather and other logistics, but sometime between March 17th and 28th, everyone will receive their trash cart and their recycle cart. Okay, slide please. The slide shows the current distribution of opt-outs and trash cart size selection. About 12% of households have enrolled for the smallest trash cart service, 64% for medium cart service, and 15% for large cart service. Our opt-out rate is currently about 8%. And you'll note from the asterisk there that this is based on about half of the eligible households that submitted a form, because you probably do recall that part of the trash cart selection process was that if people didn't respond at all, they automatically will receive the medium size gallon trash cart billed at $19.43 a month. They can change the size of that trash cart and the fee will change accordingly beginning March 31st by contacting Waste Connections. Slide, please. Brimfield staff has made a significant investment in responding to resident queries and concerns. The sustainability team has responded to about 400 queries, emails, phone calls, web submissions for about 257 hours of staff time. And this is not including the number of queries or the hours put in by our colleagues at the Community Assistance Center desk here in this building, who also spent many, many hours helping residents with questions they had about the program. Key concerns we've heard about residents regarding the structure of the program are that the contract with Waste Connections doesn't include organics collection, dumpster options, or the ability to have multiple trash carts through Waste Connections, although residents are able to put out extra bags in a receptacle, in their own receptacle for $3.50 per bag. And this is a particular concern for agriculture estate properties and properties with many trees. Empty residences are required to participate in the program or pay the opt-out fee. We've heard some frustration about that. And many residents don't want to pay the opt-out fee, or they would like an exception on various grounds, including economic hardship and medical needs. The ordinance and the contract as they currently stand don't allow much wiggle room for addressing these concerns. Slide, please, James. Okay, this slide brings us to the reason we're here tonight. We have about 3,000 waste management customers after staff put on our detective hats and spoke to all of our licensed haulers offering residential services here in Brimfield to find out what was the scoop on fees. We determined that 2 companies are charging a cart collection fee. So Waste Management has a cart removal fee for its 3,000 non-HOA customers in Brimfield. They've told staff that the fee is $65, a flat fee, but we know that some residents have called and been told $75. So we've used the $75 figure for our budget estimates. And if it turns out to be 65, great, but we didn't want to under budget for you and give you the wrong idea of what to expect from this. Republic Services charges a fee per cart, so it depends on how many carts are going back to Republic. They have an automated system, so anyone who's canceling their services does get charged that fee, but it will be credited back on their last bill or on a bill between now and when services end. To our knowledge, there are no other haulers that are charging any kind of cancellation fee or cart removal fee. Again, we're saying to the best of our knowledge, because this is what's been told to us by our contacts in these companies. For the ones that are national companies, sometimes the decision is made somewhere that is not close to here, and there's internal communications that don't always get communicated to us. So we've done our best to give you accurate numbers tonight. Slide, please. For this presentation, we've looked at a few different reimbursement levels, 100%, 75%, and 50% per household. So would we cover all the cost, 75% of the cost, or half the cost, or of course, not at all, no reimbursement. This table shows you what it would look like, what Broomfield would pay, and what the household would pay under the various options. Slide. The operational aspects of a program like this will be finalized and fleshed out by staff should council direct us to do it. We did spend some time mapping out what it could look like because we wanted to estimate the staffing impacts and be able to include that in our information to you tonight. So probably what it would look like is a form that has to be submitted along with an invoice or a receipt confirming waste management, that the person was a waste management customer and that those fees were charged. Staff would determine eligibility and then report the status back to the residents. And then within about 60 days, they would see a credit on their water bill. And for folks who don't have city water, we'll determine some other way to pay them that money. I know, I wasn't looking at my paper, so I lost where I was. Okay. Slide, please. Okay, back to the math. So we're talking about maximum budget impact here because it could be less if the fee turns out to be less, or if not everyone submits their receipts, but our best guess. So 100% reimbursement rate would look like $225,000. 75% reimbursement would be about $169,000. 50% reimbursement, about $112,000. 100, and then we looked at a fourth option that aligns with the partial property tax refund program. So this would be for our non-HOA residents who are at or below 60% AMI or seniors 65 plus. And that would be about $67,500. And then of course, option 5, if we don't do this at all, there's no budget impact. Slide. Thanks, James. And we're getting close to the end. I'm trying not to keep you here for 3 hours on this tonight. Wanted to make sure to draw attention to the staffing impact that we expect from a program like this. After conversations with our colleagues who operate the partial property tax refund and estimates and programs like that. So options 1 through 3, which require the same amount of touch, whether it's 100% or 50% reimbursement, it's still the same number of residents. So about 3,000 households. We estimate it would be 1,500 hours of staff time over a relatively short period of time, just a few months. And for reference, in case you're not aware, 1 FTE, 1 full-time employee is 2,080 hours for a whole year. And that's before you take out vacation, leave, meetings, things like that. Option 4 would be about 900 hours of staff time. It's much fewer numbers. It's about 900 households that we think would be eligible under option 4, but the eligibility requirements are more extensive because we have to look at income and age, and there's more things to verify. So it fewer households, but it takes longer, but still on balance, less of a staff impact for that one. And again, just want to be clear why these numbers are different than the ones you see in the memo is because it does not include the 1,000 Republic Service customers that we did our original budgeting around. Slide, please. So none of these options are included in the approved 2025 budget. Costs would be in addition to the unbudgeted positions that were requested when council approved the agreement back in September. And that was at a total of $182,751 for those 2 12-month positions to help with the billing of the opt-out fees and queries about billing and just the high volume of communications we know to expect. We've already seen a pretty high volume, and we know from our neighboring communities that that will increase substantially once carts begin showing up in people's driveways. The sustainability program budget, which is detailed in the memo, does not have room to absorb these costs. So if council wishes to move forward with this reimbursement program, it would require a budget amendment and or there would need to be, the expenses would need to be funded through cost savings and delaying, reducing, canceling some other sustainability related programming. Slide. Thanks, James. The Advisory Committee for Environmental Sustainability considered this memo at their February 10th meeting. ACES as a body supported recommending that council direct staff to implement a 100% reimbursement program for all affected households. It was not a unanimous decision. And also the operational mechanism that they have recommended has some pretty significant challenges and concerns with implementations. And Attorney Rogers, did you want to weigh in on that?
Ms. Rogers?
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks, Allison. So ACES had recommended that the city look at paying the operator a flat fee to take care of all the expenses across the board. This is legally possible, but operationally challenging because we don't know all the individual consumer relationships that waste management has with each person. I mean, generally they're the same, but there are nuance. We have people who might be behind on what they owe the operator. We have people who might have other fees that we're not aware of just because of the agreement that they have with that trash operator. This side contract wouldn't negate those agreements. And I fear that doing what ACES had recommended by doing this side flat fee agreement would put Broomfield in the center of that consumer relationship with this vendor and just adds complications as far as, if somebody doesn't get the right, they get billed anyways, even though the flat fee was paid, then Broomfield has to now take part in trying to remedy that situation between the operator and that resident based on their underlying contract, which we don't have a copy of. So it just gets complicated when you start to try to figure out the practicalities of doing that type of flat fee arrangement. The other concern that came out of my office was a lot of people have already paid, right? And this flat fee wouldn't necessarily cover those people. And it also gives an incentive for some of our trash operators that aren't charging a fee to go ahead and charge that fee because now they know Broomfield's going to give a flat fee. So it's not something that my office would recommend. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Slide. This is our last slide for you. We've tried to make it visually easier to know what kind of direction we're asking for, but staff would like direction from council about whether you would like to redirect financial and staff resources towards a reimbursement program, and if so, at what level? And we've included on this slide the estimated total impact to the budget. So not only the reimbursement program, but adding in those limited term appointments. And we cannot stand up a program like this without those limited term appointments. So that's what we wanted to make sure the total was in there. And then so there's option 1, again, 100% reimbursement for everybody who's affected. Option 2, 75% reimbursement for everyone affected. Option 3, 50% for everyone affected. Option 4, 100% reimbursement for households at or below 60% AMI and seniors 65 plus. And number 5 is no reimbursement. So the only budget impact there are the limited term appointments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Harvey. Who wants to go first? Don't be shy. I'll wait. I'll just go first. Oh, you win, Councilmember Leslie.
I win?
You win.
Question. Would this exclude those who have decided not to stay with the plan, but go with another vendor? Would they also be included or excluded from this?
So someone, to make sure I understand your
So
question, just so
People
someone
are
who,
allowed to opt out,
yes,
right? So those who opt out, I'm assuming will probably have to pay this fee,
okay,
but
yes.
would they be included or not included?
They are not included.
Thank you.
That all?
Mhm.
All right. Councilmember Lim?
I had some questions. In your conversations with Waste Management, I know that that staff has done some research with what other communities experienced. And Fort Collins, which within the past 9 months or so, rolled out their residential waste program, had somehow come to the good fortune that Waste Management was not charging any of their residents to collect their carts. Did you happen to bring that up to Waste Management? Like, why are we getting socked with this and Fort Collins didn't?
We had a series of conversations with Waste Management. I can't speak to if there was a specific reference point to Fort Collins. What we do know about Waste Management is they're a national company, and I don't fully understand the lines of their regional offices and decisions. And I would add to that, Fort Collins had an 18-month lead up time between when they approved the program and when they rolled it out. So they had more time to work some magic. We've had just under 6 months.
Okay. My other questions, where are the opt-out fees as a source of funding? There's a chart in the memo which lists sources of funding. Are the opt-out fees included in that?
We haven't included that. That was an oversight. Apologies. And I don't remember off the top of my head what our estimate for those opt-out fees would be. It was in the September 10th memo, but if I can ask my colleagues to pull that up and we can come back to that.
Okay, that would give us an idea of what we're working with shifting. We have to shift money around. Okay. Is the RFP back for spring cleanup? Do we have that still outstanding? Is it back? Do we know if that estimate that's in that chart that shows the expenditures for sustainability is what it says 670 is budgeted? Is that accurate?
Great question. I'm gonna make sure I don't give you the wrong number here. We don't have to run an RFP for spring cleanup every year now. Last year, there was an RFP and we now have an agreement with Western Disposal with 3 options for renewals. So this year we're able to work with them and staff has been negotiating what their proposal would be. And it's just getting to the final numbers right now. And I believe that it's going to come in under budget. That dinging is probably someone telling me what the answer is. Okay, $550,000 is what they've proposed for this year.
Okay, so we've got $120,000 under budget then, hopefully. What's what it looks like. Okay, and we've got opt-out fees. Okay, that aren't accounted for in that chart. Okay. Those are my questions. The ACES members were very enthusiastic about the negotiation option. So I need to do a little thinking. I'll listen to the rest of my colleagues. I did have another question. The memo on page 2 talks about the concerns of the residents that have been brought forward to staff. Certainly, council has heard those too. We've received emails. We've forwarded those to staff. We've received replies in the past, and this is the first time I understood in reading the memo that we had an option or some opportunity to direct staff
to work on evaluating amendments. That was my reading of page 2 in that concern section. Is that what staff meant to indicate? Is that at this time, we can put forward options that we would like staff to evaluate for amendments?
Thanks for the opportunity to clarify. What staff meant to indicate in that section was simply that there isn't much more information to speak to those concerns and options since there hasn't been direction to investigate. And some of those questions are pretty complicated. And I don't know if there's anything from the dais over there would like to add. No, okay.
Okay. Well,
Councilmember Lim, may I clarify? Are you speaking of amendments to the contract?
I'm talking about at the top of page 2 in the memo, when it states, and it did in the presentation too, when it states that staff has heard residents' concerns. And and it says that staff has not received council direction to evaluate any of those concerns. And so that seemed to me to indicate that staff was open to receive direction to evaluate concerns. And I never had that impression.
Thank you.
So Councilmember Lim and Mayor and council members, separate from the contract that we have with Waste Connection, this is a program that lives within the municipal code. And like other parts of the code, council always has the option to do a request for future action to modify that. As staff receive requests on why aren't there exceptions for X population, X group, that could be a change that if council so desired, you could make in that code. I'll use an easy, although hot example, the HOA exemption. Council in the future could decide to change the code to modify that limitation. You could also change the code and have direct staff to draft an ordinance to add an exception for a specific group that we've heard about, ag properties, for example. I think that's what staff meant about, should council make that direction, staff would work on that. To date, we have not received a request for future action for that type of work.
What about direction on things that really I don't think are stated in the code? For example, what I've heard from residents frequently is that they would like the option to pay. They would have to pay, but have multiple large trash cans for one reason or another. Is that something that we have to change in the code, or is that just something we can direct staff to talk to Waste Connections about?
Allison, I might let you answer that one. People's ability to get more than one collection bin.
That would require amending the contract. My understanding of the mechanisms is you could direct staff to do that. Our approach has been right now to be completely focused on the rollout as the program is currently architected, and not to try to muddy the waters with changes to the contract, since there is the option for people to have their own receptacle or bin of any kind and to put the extra bags of trash in. We have not had a conversation with Waste Connections about it. They didn't include that option in their original proposal. They said it didn't align with the program objectives of maximizing waste diversion to include that option. So it could happen in the future, whether it's desirable to be done right now at this moment where there's so many moving parts in terms of getting it rolled out well.
And if I can add on to that, Councilmember Lim, that might be why you and council colleagues might be feeling like there wasn't an opening for suggesting changes, because I do agree with staff that rolling it out as put in our code and as in our current contract is challenging enough. To pivot at this late stage is not ideal. And yet we all acknowledge that council does have the ability to, through your processes, direct staff in in that direction if council sees fit.
Okay, okay, thank you. Those are my questions for now.
I have an answer to your question about the opt-out fees,
Okay.
if I may, before we move on. So based on, right now, we know that 793 households have opted out. So the revenue from that on an annual basis would be $99,918. It's more than we estimated in the last memo because we were working with a 95% participation rate, and now we're at about a 92% participation.
I missed that
rate.
number. What was it?
99,918.
And,
Thank you.
and that's assuming that those who did not respond yet are not going to choose to opt out.
Correct.
Okay, okay, thank you.
So I do apologize. I'm trying to figure out an agenda link issue because Councilmember Cohen pressed his button and Councilmember Wind lit up. So what happens if you press yours? Huh. What happens when you press yours, Todd, now? Hit it now. Kenny goes away. Okay. So in order for me to do this, I might have to go back to manual because this isn't working. I won't be able to tell unless you just, he texted me and said this happened. So James is next. So as we figure this out, we'll go to you.
Thank you, Mayor. So when we're talking about the 2025 budget amendments, I'm assuming that we're only going to count revenue for this year, right? So,
One second.
sorry.
Only a minute came up and it's supposed to be 3 minutes or 5 minutes for council. So the timer's not working either. Just note that, who's ever in charge. Okay,
I won't take that long.
sorry, that's okay. Just wanted to think.
So for the budgeting, I'm assuming we're only going to talk about 9 months of revenue for this calendar year, right? On the opt-out fees?
Yes.
Okay, so I did the math before, when I was sitting here, so I figured out about $75,000. Does that sound about right for
Yep.
9 months? So we're looking at about 205,000, or sorry, not 205, $195,000 in revenue that we have that's unbudgeted, which is great news on the big item cleanup. Everybody's been wondering about that, and so that's great news that we're saving money on that. So I'm just want to be clear. So we're talking about the cost that we have here of what it will cost us, but we're talking about $200,000 of revenue that we aren't accounted for, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Um,
And the only other question I have at the moment is, I'll have thoughts also, but the question is, when you looked at the reimbursement amount for income aligned and seniors, did we also look at 100% AMI, for example? Do we look at other levels? Because, for example, the water reimbursement, water rate fund is 100% AMI. So did we evaluate that for other income levels?
We did not. We thought the most straightforward approach would be to align with the partial property tax refund and the established mechanisms for confirming eligibility.
That makes sense. That's, I think, the only question I have at the moment. Thank you, Mayor.
All right, thank you. Next is Councilmember Cohen. Sorry, he's virtually online.
Thank you, Mayor. First I should note that I am a current waste management customer. I did cancel my service. I asked about returning the cards. They didn't mention a fee. So I'm curious, I may have missed it from the part of the memo. We have in writing, this is what waste management plans to do since we have this discrepancy between 75, 65. They didn't say zero. They said nothing to me, and I've already gotten a prorated bill that doesn't include a fee. So do we know for sure what they're doing, or is there still an opening there for them to meet Republic's?
To me, that's
Offer.
two different questions. Yes, we have it in writing about the $65 fee. Do
Okay.
we know what they're going to do?
No, okay. It does seem maybe they're a little confused because apparently they're telling people lots of different answers. I did want to just speak after Councilmember Lim that I also had under the impression after we raised some of the issues that our residents had brought up back in December about these various inadvertent, I guess, problems with the contract in terms of non-residential lots getting charged an opt-out fee and other concerns, that this was the meeting where that was going to be brought up. I had an email to that effect that this meeting will be where we'll discuss that. So I was expecting that would be what we would discuss more, what potential solutions or how we could make right some inadvertent mistakes, such as charging people a lot that doesn't have a home on it, an opt-out fee, or whether there was some solution for the large agricultural lots. I'm not sure how many that is actually affects, how many there would count as agricultural lots or non-residential lots. I understand why we included them. Obviously, there's a concern if you put a big waste disposal thing out there, everything goes in it. You don't recycle, you don't get very discerning about it. But I don't know at what point or what would be the process to figure out what potential solutions we have and how many people are affected by these inadvertent charges that we didn't intend to include, such as the agricultural lots and the non-residential.
And the reason that we don't have more in-depth answers with numbers on those things is they're not straightforward questions to answer because it all depends on how parcels get classified. And we did try to look at it quickly and it wasn't possible. The current team is completely strapped just getting this out the door, along with all of those other sustainability programs that you saw in the memo. So I think as we do with many other issues, if council wants to direct us to look into this more, we will put resources into answering some of those questions. We know that sorry, go ahead, Manager.
No, I was, Councilmember Cohen, we can certainly, I was just dialoguing with Nancy, anticipating that there was going to be discussion on those items tonight. So just for clarification, by the time we get to the end of this conversation, if council is directing us to reopen negotiations and reopen that contract, we just need to be really explicit with that so we can give staff clear direction on what those items are and that we are in fact going to relook at that contract.
Can I ask a quick question? Would that include us allowing exemptions? That would change the contract if we changed our code to allow some exemptions?
It could,
A list is a
Yes.
list.
yes, because it'll change the expectations of the contractor in going into that contract, in having like the opt-out fee. If council decided to forego the entire opt-out fee, that changes the numbers that the operator was relying on to sign the contract. The same with some of the other beliefs about what the program would look like. So just as there have been potentially unintended consequences with the program as we roll out about this and the issues that staff is addressing, every time we pivot, there will be other dominoes and other unintended consequences that could happen.
Thank you. Sorry, Councilmember Cohen?
No, I just to sum up, if I understand the direction from staff is that we obviously want to have all the issues we have on one list and not do this many times, but to come back after March 31st with a request for action to take into account, all these unintended consequences, how many homes that have no home, how many addresses with no homes are there affected? How many, if we come up with a definition of an agricultural lot? I don't know if Fort Collins and the other municipalities have addressed this issue like.
They don't have exemptions for that.
Okay, but that whole research and study is something we will do, we can do, but let's wait till after March 31st is your request.
Not necessarily, Councilmember Cohen. If council wants to devise a list, sounds like we have a pretty good start on it right now and direct council to begin opening that contract as we roll out, we can certainly do that. Internally, we'll make adjustments on what some of those other initiative and programs are as I look back at our sustainability crew on the back table to ensure that we're able to bifurcate the conversations with the contractor and Nancy to make time for her folks on the legal piece for the contract as we continue to roll out. But at this point, staff doesn't have a request. We will follow council direction and adjust accordingly.
And I have to add, we have a contract in place So we cannot unilaterally change that contract. It would be reopening negotiations, and Waste Connection could say no to these asks. And make that request of waiting till later after we see the program be rolled out.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because I don't know this, how many residents we might be talking about. It could be just a few, which at point they probably wouldn't care or be glad not to be included to have to deal with that. We just don't know this stage of how much this is actually might be, if it's significant or really pretty insignificant, adjustments around the edges, which it could possibly be, depending on what other council members might be interested in. I don't see a lot of changes, but I'm just questioning which is the best timing. What point is best for us to go back to Waste Management and say, for round 2, this is the adjustments we'd like to make based on the experiences we've had so far.
These connections.
Sorry. Waste
Those are
Management.
good.
The good ones, yeah.
Okay, is that it for now? Councilmember Ward?
Thank you, Mayor. I just have one quick question about the financial numbers that you listed for the LTAs. Because I pulled up the September 10th presentation, and there you had listed for the 2 FTEs, it was $157,751. And you have 25,000 extra dollars on there. So I don't know if that was just a typo or if actual cost had increased. So I just want to clarify that first.
Hold, please. While we wait.
While we're waiting for that answer, let me follow up on Councilmember Marsh Holstrom's question. I think the intent of the original opt-out fees was to help offset the cost of the LTA positions. Similar to what you asked, but I just wanted to clarify.
And on that note, my next question was going to be, were the opt-out fees going to be partially responsible for covering the estimated $25,000 in outreach, education, and marketing? I know in that presentation it was listed as it was budgeted into the 2025 budget, and it's not an unexpected budget item like the LTAs were, but I was just curious if that fee was supposed to help offset that cost within the budget.
Allison, can I
Yes.
jump on
please.
this one? I am going to say yes. It is not a tax. It's not a revenue generator. So when we issue a fee, it might not be a one-to-one, a dollar-to-dollar correlation, but the idea is that any fee that's brought in out of a program will help pay for that program. So yes, on the 25,000 for the outreach, yes, on a portion or all of, because we didn't know exactly how much we would get of that fee of all of the LTs. Yes, for, the payment of Allison's salary here tonight. So it is not a revenue generator that would make it a tax. It is a fee that was added on in the hopes to offset all the cost of the program.
And if I may add quickly, it does not offset the amount of time, effort, and energy that this crew has put into rolling this out. That is frankly only just beginning. I wish we were within $25,000. That is not going to be the case.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Rogers and Ms. Hoffman, for that. I figured that was the case, but I wanted to be explicitly clear for my council colleagues and the public that that's what we had anticipated that for. I don't know if you need me to wait for the other answer or not.
I won't make a joke about a game show. I'm starting to sweat a little bit.
If we need more time, that's fine. I just want to make sure I'm not steamrolling over you if you have the answer.
I don't have the answer. I
Okay,
appreciate
great.
it, Councilmember.
I think let's see, this is going to be a little challenging in terms of coming up with a direction for staff, because on the one hand, I do recognize that there are individuals who are going to be cost burdened by a potentially $60 to $75 opt-out fee based on the income that they have currently and the fact that we are requiring them to be part of this program. I recognize that. I also recognize that we don't really have the budget for doing an opt-out fee plus the LTAs or the FTEs, whatever you'd like to call them. And so I'm struggling with that. I certainly would not do options 1, 2, or 3. I certainly would not go forward with that. But I think given the current budgetary situation, along with the other expenses that are going to be partially covered by the opt-out fee that certain individuals have already paid for, that I would lean probably more with option 5, because the other thing that I would add on with that is if Waste Management is the only one charging a fee and they can't seem to get their act together as to whether they want to do a $65 fee for certain residents or they want to do a $75 fee for other residents, or like Councilmember Cohen, not charge a fee at all. I have a problem authorizing reimbursement for a fee when Waste Management itself does not seem like it wants to be uniform in whether that fee will apply to everyone. So I think I would lean more with option 5, but I'm open to going to option 4 for right now. We'll see what the rest of my colleagues,
Thank you.
we'll see what my colleagues have to say.
And I do have an answer to your question. Yes, it's a mistake. The total cost of the LTAs, the FTE is 157,751. So really sorry for that. And I'm going to ask my sustainability colleagues in the back of the room, can you make a copy of the slide in the Google Doc and update the numbers so that we can at least get the right numbers in front of everyone, and then we can make sure clerks has the corrected presentation.
Great. I was just happy that you mentioned which presentation it was on so I could double check, because if not, I probably would have just gone right over our heads.
No, yeah, so we'll get that corrected right now if we can, if not in the council presentation folder. And I wanted to say one thing about the Waste Management fees. They have individual agreements with all of their customers, and some of those may be that there was a $65 fee. Some of them may be it was $75. Maybe Councilmember Cohen had an agreement with them that didn't specify a fee. So it's not uniform across the board necessarily, not because they don't want it to be, but they have not contracts, but individual agreements with customers. So it's not, I don't want to read too much into the intention on their part.
All right, is that all? Okay, next is Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. So I'm just looking, like listening to Councilmember Ward and kind of thinking along the same lines, and I don't want to spend a ton of staff time on a one-time fee when we have this list, this growing list of items. And my only question here is just putting a list together and having an initial conversation with the waste hauler is not opening the contract. That's just finding out which pieces would they be receptive to, like the second bin or exempting properties that have no one living there, whatever, like what are they receptive to? My desire would be to put this comprehensive list together and just have a conversation, not open the contract, not assume we're going to do that, and just come back with feedback of where are they receptive and where are they not. That's what I'm thinking.
And while I appreciate that approach and wish that was as simple to create that list and have that conversation, the conversations have been numerous, doesn't quite capture the number of times that we've had conversations. And each one of those elements, Councilmember Anderson, impacts a different element. And so to have a conversation about one item or even that whole list of items and not open up that contract, it's unrealistic. So again, it's a very simple approach to say, why wouldn't you be open for us to be able to say these unintended consequences? We didn't look at them before. Would you be willing to make some modifications and not open that contract? That's asking a lot of the third party, and it's asking a lot of the team to continue to have these conversations about unintended consequences.
Okay, it wouldn't be not ever opening the contract, to just be what would they actually be receptive to? And then we could hear back, and then we could say yes or no, we would want to pursue something. Because it's really hard to send you in with a list of things to say X, Y, and Z and start to open a contract when we don't know which things are receptive to. So it sounds like it's not really council's choice. It sounds like it's just like a no-go.
It's definitely council's choice. Council directs staff to have these conversations. That's what we'll do.
But you're saying that they wouldn't be receptive to a conversation to see what's possible.
I'm saying it's more complicated and time consuming. But if council directs staff to take a list of unintended consequences and have additional dialogue, we will definitely do that.
Okay, I will think about this some more and listen to my colleagues have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Henkel.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation, all the work that you've done. I really want to recognize that. This has been many, many months, many, many hours, and I appreciate your work. First, this is the only real question that I have. I'm leaning more towards 4, with the thought that $67,000 might not come into fruition. So it's all, based on showing that you are charged that fee, right? And so would you just speak more to that as far as what that might look like? And the programs that we already have set up for below 60% AMI and seniors that are 65 and years and older.
It does put a burden on the resident to provide additional documentation and to seek out. I'm looking at Garrett in the back. If you have more information about the nature of the documentation and what that process would look like. What I know is it takes about an hour per application for staff to determine the eligibility, but I'm not as familiar with the details of what residents would need to submit.
And then in addition to that question, I know that they'll address that. Maybe you can answer also, do we have maybe things on file already and make it easier for us? Or are they gonna have to represent the same information?
That I can answer. We do have things on file, but they can't share that with us. The data and privacy agreements, it's not possible for the housing folks to share the information they have with us to determine eligibility. The residents would have to sign a waiver and there would be a whole process around it. It's simpler to just get it a second time.
Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong about that, Garrett.
Good evening. My name is Garrett McDaniel, Sustainability Manager here for Broomfield. So how the reimbursement program looks like, and so we've had conversations with our housing division who manages these reimbursement programs, as well as our utility billing administrator as well. So we would likely have a form on the website that folks can download and then email that to our sustainability inbox. They would need to attach receipts and things like that. We would also need to be present, likely here, for folks to come in. If they don't have access to computers and things like that, we would need to be present so that we can do that in person as well. And talking with other staff, we really do need to, we're talking seniors here, so we need to handhold folks to make sure that we can walk them through the process. So it is, we calculate roughly 45 minutes per application for us to process.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, I'm leaning more on 4, and if we could just ask Waste Connections, if they would at least have the conversation about the instances that have been brought to our attention without opening up a contract. It seems like that would be an email. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councilmember Delgadillo.
Thank you, Mayor. So part of the discussion is surrounding whether should we move forward with some sort of reimbursement, whether that comes out of existing budget or whether we amend that. Question for you all is, do you have a list of things that would get booted if we were to say, hey, we need to keep this in the budget that we have? Make it up with savings, probably have to kick some things down the road. Is there a priority list for the initiatives that we have so we'd get a sense of what we would be losing out on this year?
No, but you can start with the list that we talked about at the focus session, those items. And it's hard to ask staff that, Councilmember Delgadillo, because they're in this for sustainability, right? And so to ask them to prioritize all of it's important to them, and then they don't want anyone to not receive what they are hoping to receive. I can tell you that the mindset, speaking on behalf of staff from sustainability, they certainly didn't think that they were going to be doing universal trash hauling and answering the questions and doing that rollout. So again, it's a separate conversation because you have some that are clean energy focused and passionate. And then you have other duties as assigned. And so they've been working for the last 2 years on duties as assigned. So we'd have to kind of dig into what their kind of 3-year plan looked like this year and subsequently. We anticipate the rollout, although March is the kickoff. That's going to be a 6-month endeavor from a marathon for those folks. So we'd need a little more time to really evaluate what's going to go and what isn't going to go in the latter part of 25 into 26. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. I mean, I'm asking you all to choose your favorite child, basically, and your least favorite child, and which child gets the boot this year.
Yeah.
So I understand the complexity there. Okay. That said, I recognize that this is a tricky decision. I think we passed this because we believe that this is going to be a very impactful project. And I do still stand by that. And I still believe that is the case, that this is was a tough, meaningful thing. And we need to get the rollout right and have people feel decent about it at least. And so I think given that, I am inclined to support option 4. And I would not be inclined to amend our budget. I know that's tricky, but I know we have a lot of important projects going on and we prioritize this. We said this was important. So we move forward with that priority. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Wynn. Oh, you're next. Yeah, you are.
And we have a Post-it note over here.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, was that you that hit? I'm sorry. I'll come back to you after Ken. He's first time, so you'll be in the second round. My apologies.
Thank you, Mayor.
Okay.
Sorry, I just want to say congratulations. We appreciate your presentation again. It's very insightful to seeing this. For me, I don't have any questions, but I do have I guess, staff direction. My staff direction is option 3 and 4, just because I do think that residents who are impacted by this, 60% below AMI are the likely ones who are going to ask for assistance. And I think that they definitely deserve a chance and an opportunity to get some of that assistance. So, and option 3, just because I know some folks are going to also be hurt and maybe not also be in that threshold with the 60%. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Anybody who hasn't gone first round, any feedback before we go to second round? All right. Going, this is second round, right? Yeah. Okay. Councilmember Cohen.
Thank you, Mayor.
Hmm?
Um, I was gonna say again, I'm a waste management customer. While I think there was well-intentioned initially, and it wasn't just waste management when this first came up, that would be charging fees. I'm really not inclined to let them off the hook. And even though it'd be nice to be the popular one and pay everybody's fee, I just don't, I have a hard time supporting that at this point. I think I'd rather put our energy into fixing the unintended flaws that were inadvertently in the original agreement. I don't want to charge people who don't have a residence an opt-out fee. That's not what was planned, and figure out a solution for people who have animals and run a farm and are being forced to pay an opt-out fee for a service they would never have used in the first place. That would be where I'd want to put our energy. So while I can appreciate number 4 and I appreciate staff bringing it up, and I do think it's quite possibly a much smaller number than that, I do think your point about waste management having different deals with every customer is probably quite apt. I seem to recall when I signed on to waste management, I paid for my carts, and that was and paid an extra fee just to get them, and that may be why they're not charging me so far a fee to get rid of them. So I think I would be leaning to 5 at this point.
All right. Thank you. Councilmember Marshall Holston.
Mayor, I did have one follow-up question on the budget expenses. The 147,000 for municipal waste services, I'm assuming that's for our CCOB trash hauling. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Who do we use for that?
Western Disposal.
Is there any savings to us joining the, I mean, I don't even know how that would look if we were to join Waste Connections.
We have, where we would, our contract with Western Disposal doesn't allow that at this point in time.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. And then, so on the, I mean, I obviously proposed this a long time ago, and I am also a waste management customer. I remember calling them back last fall and asking about that, and the guy I spoke to said, "Oh, we're just gonna waive the fee for you." But I didn't go through with the cancellation at that time. Now my bill online says there's a $75 fee. So I don't know what's gonna happen with my bill. So I'm assuming I'm gonna have to pay the $75 fee. But I agree with Councilmember Cohen that I don't like the idea of letting waste management off the hook to do whatever they want to do with random people, which is, you know, one of the reasons why I supported this program to begin with is because I think the haulers individually are not a good business model, and I've had bad experience with my current hauler, among others. So all that said, I don't like the idea of charging somebody a fee, making somebody pay a fee for something we made them do. That just feels wrong to me, that we're making them switch to our service, but then they have to charge a fee through no fault of their own. But I also understand the budgetary restraints. And so I think I'm leaning towards option 4. I appreciate you all bringing that before us, because I do think that hits the most impacted people, the seniors and those making 60% AMI or lower. So I would support number 4.
Thank you. Do we have the updated slide? Yeah, because okay, because that's a lot higher than it would be. Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Mayor. Manager Hoffman, I have a quick question about some of the budget. I know that last week, time is just distorted in my world with school. So whenever we had the conversation about the ranked choice voting, in that memo, there was I believe it was a budgeted item for this year to implement ranked choice voting for us to hire a consultant to do the audit, risk limiting audit setup. And that was 175,000 or some 170,000. Because we're not going through with ranked choice voting and doing that RLA, what has become of those budgeted funds? in the city and county clerk's office.
Ms. Clemens, I'm just looking at you, you don't need to come down to the podium. Just give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Was that 170 budgeted?
Okay. I was just curious because that might be a potential place where we can reallocate funds. If council's direction is to do any one of the 4 options that require an additional expense outside the 2 FTEs. That was just my only other question. I wanted to
Thank you.
do that. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Did you choose an option? Did you do one? 5, but open to 4. Did you want me to come back to you? There's a list. I have a list going. Did I miss you? Can you wait till I get to the next person in line? Did you press your button? Try pressing your button. Yeah. Okay, you're third. Mayor Pro Tem Chef.
Thank you, Mayor. So we came in tonight to
And you're gone. Did you hit it again? Oh my God, this is crazy. No, fix this. Okay, you are third though. Sorry, Mayor Pro Tem.
That's all right. Thank you, Mayor. So we came in tonight to discuss the reimbursement program for an issue that was told to us before this contract was approved. We are now also talking about potential negotiations, changes to a contract. I'm sure there's a significant number of residents that would like to be carved out of that future contract as well. So I'm sure that there's going to be plenty of interest if that contract is open. And to remind you, a contract that's, which the ink is still drying on this contract. I do have a question. So, the source of these funds are undetermined, what would go. There was an idea of utilizing funds that were originally used, budgeted for ranked choice voting. The memo states that the reimbursement funds could come from the budget for the large item pickup, which would likely alter that program. Again, to remind my council colleagues, this is a wildly popular program, especially in those non-HOA for those non-HOA residents. It sounds like the reimbursement fees could come from the opt-out fees. Again, those were originally going to go towards supporting the 2 FTEs to help roll out this program. I guess I don't really have a question on this because it would need to be a budget amendment or funding would need to come through cost savings. So I guess maybe that's my question is when you talk about cost savings, what cost savings are we going to have that would allocate money towards these reimbursement fees?
It would mean reducing, delaying, postponing, canceling certain programs and services. That it could be within the sustainability budget or it could come from somewhere else, if I understood Manager Hoffman correctly.
Okay. That's
Did I
enough.
answer your question?
It's enough information for me. So, I guess I asked my council colleagues, what is the reason for this reimbursement? One of the first complaints we heard about this program was from residents that have large amounts of yard debris that, would be picked up along with their trash. Now they would need to pay a per bag fee for pickup. It was reported that there was no extra fee for them to have this picked up in past practices. Are we going to reimburse those costs as well in the future? Another complaint that we heard about was specific to rural agricultural. What about these rural agricultural homes that have to have a special type of waste hauling for manure? Are we going to reimburse those costs as well? For a different policy, the idea of RV and parking restrictions have been considered in the past, and there's still desire to have this come forward again. Are we going to reimburse people parking fees associated with their trailers and RVs when they must pay to park those large vehicles at a storage facility? So I didn't support this contract. Part of it was because there were some issues. There were a lot of issues that were still remaining. This was one of them, but we moved forward with that contract. I do not support reimbursing for these fees. That's all I have, Mayor. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Nguyen.
I just want to ask, can we do options 3 and 4 together, or it has to be just one option?
Theoretically, yes. Do you mean 50% reimbursement for
Yeah.
households at or below 60%
Exactly. And then
AMI?
100% for households below, or 100% reimbursement for households at or below 60% AMI and seniors at 65. Does that make sense? Like, some folks would, in theory, get more reimbursement just because of their higher needs of priority. But of course, the 50% for the reimbursements for folks who just are requesting this. Does that make sense?
Got you. So everyone gets at least 50%
Yes.
reimbursement and some people get 100% based
Yeah.
on the eligibility criteria.
Yeah.
Yes, more hours of staff time
Okay.
and a hybrid of the financial impact would be required.
That's my only question. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Leslie?
Thank you, Mayor. My recollection is that this program had at least some component of it was to reduce overall costs for the homeowner in terms of trash collection. Is that right? So it seemed to me that because there is hypothetically going to be some cost savings, that would offset individual costs for these fees. So my position would be 5.
Okay, thank you. Any other feedback, comments, questions from council, those on the fence, so we can give clear direction to staff? Councilmember Anderson?
So I'll just clarify that I would go with number 5. Thank you.
And so where are we with direction, Ms. Harvey? Oh, Councilmember Lim, sorry.
I would prefer option number 4, as I add up the opt fee and the savings that Allison pointed out from the budgeted amount for the bulky item pickup was someone in, I think, about $120,000 from the budgeted amount. So we would have 120,000 savings. We will have our bulky item pickup. And then we'll have $100,000 from the opt-out fee, and that'll come close to covering option 4.
Right. Any other comments from council? So are we kind of seeing consensus for option 4?
I have 5 with option 5 and 5 that can live with 4.
This is happening a lot. I kind of concur with Councilmember Lim's assessment. I think I would go with option 4. All right, and I do think I agree with Councilmember Henkel and my colleagues that I don't think having a conversation definitely means we are opening up the contract. I think, this is our partner. These are some things that we're discovering as this process rolls out. It doesn't have to be before rollout, but I think that I agree, that the people without empty homes shouldn't be paying for garbage, and that our rural homes, especially in Wilcox, this didn't account for their special needs. And I don't think asking for a few exemptions is going to be a deal breaker. I was speaking with the mayor of Arvada today, Mayor Simpson, who they recently went through this process, and they ended up choosing Republic, but it was Waste Connections that was charging the pickup cart fees and doing what Waste Management is doing to us. She told me that Waste Management lost quietly and peacefully and didn't charge any fee. So I don't know what's going on in the garbage wars, But I do think there's a lot of different things going on. And I kind of lean toward Councilmember Cohen, where we don't know if everybody's getting charged this fee. So these are really, really on the high end. And I think it could be a lot lower than we're estimating. I know we're being cautious, but it's also on the person to apply for the reimbursement. So just by attrition, I don't think they're going to be that high. So thank you all very much. Thanks for riding through this with us. It's been a priority for council for several years, and we've heard from so many community members who have been begging us to please reduce the lunacy of the multiple trash trucks on our roads that someone ultimately has to pay for too with the road damage. So thank you all again. And if we need to kind of get the rollout done to discuss amendments after, I think that's fine. I hear you. There's a lot of pieces to juggle right now. So thank you. And thank you for coming here tonight in your former role. All right, our next item on the agenda is an analysis and considerations related to Broomfield's minimum and livable wage. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, and I'll ask our staff to begin the discussion.
Thank you, Mayor. And Jeff Romine, our economist, is going to introduce this item and then turn it over to AECom reps that are standing directly behind him. Mr. Romine.
Thank you, Manager Hoffman, Mayor Pro Tem, and council members. So back at the focus session that you held in 2024, so just about a year ago, one of the items that came forward from the focus session was asking staff to look directly at livable wage and complete an analysis. So tonight we're going to provide an overview of what that analysis came out with, which was completed by AECom. I will just add a couple of comments before I introduce my colleagues, my consulting colleagues from AECom, and that is we looked at it. One of the things that came through the City Council focus session was consideration of possibly joining the Adams County Initiative or the Boulder Communities Initiative around the same thing and the analysis that they were doing. In working with both staffs of both of those groups, and then also talking with the consulting teams from each of them, we determined that the best approach was to focus on Broomfield wholly and follow through on the direction from City Council that came from that focus session. Those are both focusing on minimum wage as opposed to a livable wage. So that was part of it, was thinking through that. Further, the Boulder County communities were pretty far along in their analysis, so joining theirs was very difficult. And the Adams County one was actually pretty far along also. We did participate. I have participated and worked with staffs on both of those, as well as talked to the consultants for those teams. So we do have a sense of what was going on and how they move forward. So there was a number of touch points, especially with the Boulder County, or I'm sorry, the Boulder Communities analysis that was done, where I was working with their lead staff to understand and work and talk through their studies. As a reference and as a reminder, one of the things that I happened to do in my previous position was bring forward the minimum wage and livable wage items that we were doing in Denver at the time. And so I did most of the analytic work on it there. So I had a better sense than most people of exactly what these were going to take. As mentioned, there were two studies going on, and while they were looking at minimum wage and possibly livable wage, we did narrow ours to be a little bit more focused on livable wage in that analysis. So one is the Boulder Communities, the Adams County one that I already mentioned. Obviously, Boulder County went forward with theirs roughly about a year ago, and they did that with a series of surveys, but didn't necessarily do an analytic analysis. I mentioned Denver's already. So those are all in place and moving forward. And then also Edgewater has a minimum wage here in Colorado. So they are above that. Right now, that range, as you may or may not know, is $14.81 in the state of Colorado and ranges all the way up to $18.81 for the minimum wage in Denver right now. The other thing that I just want to mention is as our consulting team worked through it and the interplay that occurs as I was managing this project, is there's not a whole lot of history and knowledge about localized minimum wages and how they come through and what the impacts or outcomes are. So I reference that because there are a fair number of studies that have talked about it, academic studies, but we're pretty new in the sense of localized minimum wages. Some of them go back, as an example, in Washington and Seattle and San Francisco, back roughly 10 years. But generally speaking, most of the minimum wage changes and livable wage activities, but minimum wage changes have occurred at the state level, i.e. like Colorado has done, and you don't see it necessarily at the local level other than the last few years. So therefore, I would just let you know that Denver's has been in place as a full minimum wage change roughly 5 years now. That's just not enough time, nor is the economic data available to really do an impact analysis or outcome analysis. So really what we're talking about is the analytic analysis of what's going on with the economy and how that interplays. So I give you those references just so that you have that sense as a starting place. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my consulting colleagues at AECOM. Chris Brewer will kick it off very briefly. Chris?
Thank you, Jeff. Just for the record, I think there are at least 3 economists in the room. That's kind of fun. For the record, Mayor Pro Tem, council members, my name is Chris Brewer with AECOM, 30 years of experience doing economic development and economic studies. Our intention tonight is not to overcomplicate what in fact is a complicated conversation. Fundamentally tonight, as you think about the presentation, we're ultimately trying to, again, not set policy tonight, but to think about and simplify a conversation down to, are we doing a minimum wage? Are we doing a living wage? When are we implementing it? So what's the first year of implementation? Boulder County is doing 2030. Our numbers assume 2030, but that's not to say that's the year you have to choose. And then number 3 is this inflation question. How does the rate grow after 2030? Those are relatively simple questions, but I think, again, unlike the past conversation, which is operationally quite complex, the economy might not notice the long-term implications of trash removal. But when you change minimum wages, the businesses will notice it, and you will in fact be giving the economy, and it's a non-technical term, a little bit of a nudge. The city economy, the regional economy will notice it a little bit. And that nudge is the one thing we're here tonight to talk about, to give you a sense of what those implications could be. Again, trying to balance esoteric economic theories with pragmatic, practical notions of what's most likely going to happen. So without further ado, turn the floor to my colleague, Christina, and we'll get into it.
Thanks, Chris. Good evening, everybody. My name is Christina Biedny. I'm an economist with AECOM. And I think with that, I will just launch into it. So next slide, please. Again, by way of really quick background, the federal minimum wage has not been changed in the last 15 years. So at the federal level, it is legal to pay people $7.25 an hour. That is in light of extraordinary inflation and increase in cost of living, especially in the state of Colorado, where quotes are upwards of close to 1.25 times more expensive than elsewhere. And cost of basic needs, housing, healthcare, childcare have continued to grow in excess of inflation. And this conversation is intended to address the potential for Broomfield to join other localities nationwide who are looking at this problem or question of, would a local minimum wage allow the economy locally to react or adjust to these increased costs of living? Next slide, please. I know Jeff mentioned it. Oh, I'm sorry, the numbers got crunched, but this is just a really quick visual of where the current local minimum wages are in Colorado. And again, not to belabor the point, but unincorporated Boulder County, Edgewater, and Denver have all implemented scheduled minimum wage changes from now until 2030 approximately, at which point they're anticipated to adjust with inflation, which again, these are estimates based on best data available for inflation in the future, but they range pretty substantially. In the long run, in 2035, Colorado's state minimum wage is just under $20 approximately.
And these other local minimum wages may range anywhere from $3 to $9 an hour higher than that state minimum. Next, please. I'm going to open with a little bit of terminology just to differentiate the minimum wage, which is the legal stipulated lowest wage that an hourly worker can be paid, versus this concept of a living wage or a self-sufficiency wage. Research has shown that a living or self-sufficiency wage would be set at a level that allows employees to meet basic needs, inclusive of things like housing, food, transportation, childcare. The graph in the middle is intended to illustrate what that minimum wage at a self-sufficiency level might look like for Broomfield and surrounding counties. The report was done in 2022, so this is adjusted for inflation to estimate what that would look like in 2030. And what you can see is that Broomfield and Boulder both sit at about a $25 an hour local, living or self-sufficiency wage. I should note that this is for single adult households. So this is one single individual without children and without a partner. So the expectation is that that self-sufficiency wage would be even higher once you start accounting for families or multi-unit households. Next, please. A few other terms that you'll hear me pepper around. The workforce most broadly is inclusive of all currently working individuals, as well as those who are unemployed but actively seeking work. And I say this to differentiate because the workers are those that do not include the unemployed seeking work. So our analysis focuses strictly on those who are actively employed. And where we will further branch off is to the subset of directly and potentially affected workers as being those as workers who will directly see or feel the impacts of a minimum wage change based on their wage level. Next, please. Our analysis puts together 3 different scenarios. This is very much intended to be an illustrative example of the range of possibilities. So by no means are these prescriptive or set in stone for options that Broomfield must choose, but it's meant to highlight what could happen. So for purposes of our analysis, everything assumes that a local minimum wage would go into effect as of January 1st, 2026. The status quo, or the red line, would mean no changes whatsoever to the minimum wage, maintaining the state of Colorado's minimum. And again, with inflation adjustments, that would put things around $17 an hour by 2030. The middle scenario, or moderate growth is what I'll refer to it as, applies a somewhat moderate annual growth rate to the minimum wage for 5 years through 2030, with adjustments for inflation thereafter. So again, that 2030 benchmark would put things at about $20 an hour. And then the self-sufficiency concept would target a $25 minimum wage by 2030 with adjustments for inflation thereafter. And this would be largely in line with the unincorporated Boulder's current schedule. There is a legal maximum under the local minimum wage legislation whereby the annual increases can't exceed 15%. So to do a small comparison, you'll see that the self-sufficiency schedule as currently illustrated is 11%, and that's not the legal maximum, but I think it maintains the reasonable level of that self-sufficiency concept.
And the only thing to point out on this slide is when we talk about that long-term implication of the living wage. So again, if you choose to index it to inflation or how you choose to index it.
Can you
Again,
speak closer to the mic because we have people
apologies.
listening. That's okay.
The only point I wanted to make here is the long-term consequences of the policy choice. So the more you think about that long-term and index rate for how this grows, again, that rate will grow. And so thinking about what that means for the long term is something to be mindful of.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. And with that, I will bounce into the actual results of our analysis, starting with how we would anticipate those 3 minimum wage scenarios to affect specifically workers and households. Next, please. We looked at three categories or three metrics, I'll call them in particular. The first being just quantitatively, how many workers would we anticipate to be both directly and potentially affected by a minimum wage change? The second question is, how would a minimum wage adjustment change employment? So would there be job gains, job losses? What would that effect look like? And finally, how would a change in minimum wage ultimately impact real wages? So how much an hourly worker could expect to make hourly into the future and what that looks like on an annual basis. Next, please. To help illustrate or differentiate this concept of directly and potentially affected workers, this reflects the self-sufficiency scenario of $25 by 2030. So imagine that you're making $17 an hour currently, or between now and 2030. Anyone making that $25 or less will automatically receive a benefit from a change in the minimum wage. You're gonna make the jump. The potentially affected is a much smaller subset that sits above or beyond the directly affected workers. And think of this as the managers or supervisors of those hourly workers. The reality here is that if there's not at least an incremental shift for those that sit above the entry level or the lowest wage workers, you're going to see wage compression that might disincentivize the supervisors and the managers to maintain their position and potentially look elsewhere for jobs. So the reality is that there is still a small threshold of individuals that should also see a benefit from any minimum wage adjustment. And then obviously anyone making beyond that margin would be not affected at all by a minimum wage change. So you wouldn't be a minimum wage worker, so to speak. Next, please. With that, these are the actual results of those numbers of individuals. So our analysis suggests that under the status quo, which means no changes, Broomfield continues to follow Colorado state minimum wage, reaching about $17 an hour by 2030. Fewer than 200 workers would fall into that cumulative directly and potentially affected worker category. So there's not very many workers making $17 or less by 2030 that would see a substantial increase based on a change. When you move to the moderate growth and self-sufficiency scenarios, you see considerable increases in the number of people that would see benefits therein. So we get to almost 5,000 workers cumulatively, directly, and potentially affected at the moderate level, and more than 10,000 workers would see effects at the self-sufficiency level of $25. Next, please. We can further disaggregate those results to an interesting level at the sectors. So the question becomes, okay, does this impact different areas of the economy differently? And the reality is it does. So under the moderate and self-sufficiency scenarios, what you'll notice is that the accommodation and food services, so restaurants, hotels, et cetera, and retail trade would have the highest concentration of individuals being directly affected by changes in minimum wage. The other of the 5 largest categories would be manufacturing, healthcare and social assistance, and administrative support. And then a small portion is the other sectors of the economy, which largely don't even fall under the minimum wage category, so to speak. So this is expected. Sorry, next slide, please. Even further beyond the sector level, we can look at specific occupations that may be most affected. Under the status quo, so again, no changes, Colorado state minimum wage, those 200 workers that I mentioned previously only fall into 4 occupational categories, the majority of which are restaurant workers, waiters, waitresses, hosts and hostesses, et cetera. When we move to the moderate growth scenario, we've increased the number of workers that we anticipate being affected and the number of occupations that those individuals hold. So of these workers, they hold 35 different occupations, but the key here is that only 8 of them make up the majority of the affected workers. And beyond restaurant waiters, waitresses, hosts and hostesses, this list expands to include things like retail salespeople, maids and housekeeping, and home health and personal aides. Next slide, please. taking it one step further to that self-sufficiency level where you see an even further increase. So now we're talking about significantly more directly affected workers encompassing over 73 occupations. And the majority of those workers hold one of 18 occupations listed on the right-hand side. So we've even further expanded the number and the types of workers that would be affected at that self-sufficiency level. Next, please. With that, I'll move on to the employment changes. Now, I'll preface this by saying that this is probably the most contentious element of any minimum wage study. The knee-jerk reaction is almost always, everyone's going to lose their job. This is going to go backwards, sideways, upside down. So I'd like to put a little bit of context and I guess provide some background to the literature and the research that supports that that may not necessarily be the case. So next slide, please. Think of this as a seesaw, teeter-totter. I've been back and forth as to what you call these things, but a balance beam. Yes, there are the potential for losses, but there are similarly some offsetting gains that are often overlooked or not taken into quite as much consideration that may be necessary. When you think about the economic consequences of a minimum wage change, wages are increased, businesses shoulder that cost and have increased labor costs, excuse me. With that, they may choose to substitute away from low wage labor, moving towards technology, automation, potentially just downsizing lower wage workers for more productive, fewer higher paid workers. They also have the option to increase prices to consumers, which would have the effect of decreasing demand across the board, right? Your prices go up, you're going to shop less, you're going to do less, you might eat out less. And finally, businesses may reach the point where they consider closure or relocation due to the burden that the increased labor cost might apply. However, on that opposite side of the balance, we have things like people are getting paid more means they're going to spend more. So instead of that idea that prices go up and demand goes down, now you've got that counterbalance of, well, people are still spending more because they're making more. So where does that net out? Beyond that, there's the idea that those low wage workers, now that they're seeing more money in their pocket, have been shown to become more productive. So they are more likely to want to continue their role in their increased wage job, and the business benefits from that. So they have less of a reason to offset, or they have more to offset their potential losses. And then finally, reduced turnover costs. So the concept that you're not losing you're not losing workers because they're not being paid enough. So you're saving in rehiring new individuals, training those individuals. Estimates range pretty widely, but turnover in particular is a large cost for businesses and varies by industry.
May I ask a quick question? It's me.
Yes.
I look at that and I like symmetry, and I'm wondering why you didn't include a reduced dependency on public assistance. Because that's one of the things we hear from low wage workers at the Walmart, they were encouraging all their employees to get SNAP benefits. So why wouldn't that be one of the offsetting gains?
It's a very good question. There is a whole separate body of research dealing with the benefits cliff and the idea that it may actually disincentivize people from taking on higher wage jobs because they might lose those benefits. But you're exactly right. There would be an offsetting counterbalance because of those social programs. The data, and I'll caveat this by saying that this whole balancing act is extraordinarily difficult to measure. The data availability, the ability to do all of this kind of simultaneous netting and work it through the economy is almost impossible from a modeling standpoint. So those social programs become one element of that. The data is extremely restricted and makes it difficult to model that in, but you're right. It should probably be symmetric. I could add a block, but yes, you're right. Next slide, please. So how does this get done, right? How do you estimate the changes in employment when all of these competing factors and all the data hangups and are such a concern? There is a very large, longstanding body of literature on this topic, and it has pivoted fairly considerably in the last 10 to 15 years. So coming back to that knee-jerk reaction of increasing minimum wages will destroy jobs, the end. A lot of the mentality and a lot of the research and support has continued to show that the effects are actually not nearly as substantial as they once appeared. That's a combination of just more research, more years of analysis and looking at this under different circumstances, as well as new methodologies, which I won't get into, but there's been advances in economics in that vein as well. Generally speaking, the most recent literature supports the idea that these employment changes are near zero. So there might be some limited negative impacts, but largely the literature shakes out with very small negative or zero implications for job changes. And with that, I'd like to highlight the fact that Broomfield's economy is definitively unique relative to some of the others that Jeff mentioned previously. Boulder, Denver, the other studies that are out there have chosen different elasticities. They've chosen a different approach to model this and do the calculations. But we believe that the methods and the numbers chosen for this particular analysis reflect the uniqueness of Broomfield's economy relative to those factors. Next slide, please. So with that, here's the shock and awe. The estimates of this analysis suggest that under the moderate growth scenario, again, very limited to some small positive potential effects, so actual job gains in the economy, but in the worst case scenario, between 1,300 and 2,800 jobs might be lost under both the moderate growth and self-sufficiency scenarios by 2030. So this is not an annual figure. This is not to suggest that close to 3,000 jobs per year might be lost. This is the case that in aggregate over the 5-year period starting in 2026, this number of individuals may face changes to their employment as a direct result of the minimum wage changes. Again, this does not imply changes in business activity or business presence. That would be a whole separate analysis, whole separate data set. So this is strictly number of workers on the basis of the wage that they're making and the thought around how many of those jobs might have a negative effect. Next slide, please. Wrapping up the workers and households, I will step to the wage changes, which are luckily a little bit more straightforward. Next slide, please. So again, we're talking about this idea that by 2030, under the status quo state minimum wage, approximately $17 an hour, we're comparing to the reality where a self-sufficiency wage might be $25 an hour. What this would result in is that by 2030 or in 2030, so standing in 2030, making $17 versus making $25 an hour would make that self-sufficiency worker have wages 46% higher than under the status quo scenario. And it's a little bit easier to stomach in the numbers. We're talking just under $36,000 annually at the $17 level versus $52,000 at the $25 level. Cumulatively, over that 5-year period from 2026 to 2030, that under the moderate growth scenario would amount to $21,000 more, or about $4,200 a year. And then similarly, under that $25 self-sufficiency wage, they'd be making close to $45,000 more, or about $9,000 annually versus maintaining the state minimum wage. Next, please. With that, I will flip the script a little bit to talk about the effects on businesses. So we know that minimum wage earners will see positive benefits in the way of more money in their pocket. They have the potential downside of maybe losing some jobs because of the balance of increased labor costs, but now we'll look at it from the business side of things. Next slide, please. Bring back my teeter-totter here. Again, businesses will bear the brunt of the increase in labor costs because of an increased minimum wage. They may choose to offset those labor costs by increasing prices to consumers, potentially closing or relocating. There may be the longer term effect that businesses will choose not to enter the market under a higher minimum wage. I think it's worth noting that under the current circumstances in Colorado with the neighboring minimum wage changes, that's slightly less likely, difficult to measure, but there's not a lot of room to flee to lower wage areas when the concept is taking root surrounding Broomfield. And then we do have the same offsetting gains consideration on the opposite side, inclusive of the, well, I guess in this case, it wouldn't be inclusive of the social programs unless we count the extent that businesses have to contribute to Social Security and things of that nature. Next slide, please. It's very important to realize that the proportion of labor, or excuse me, the labor as a proportion of operating costs varies widely by sector. And you'll see that highlighted here in the blue rows of the table. Coming back to the food services and accommodation, which you'll remember from the pie chart being one of the largest of those directly affected workers, restaurants and accommodation businesses have a significantly larger portion of their operating budget dedicated to labor costs, which would imply that they may have an increased burden of stomaching these costs or adapting to the changes relative to retail trade where they sit at under 12%. Next slide, please. I'm not going to dive into this. I'll let you guys kind of sift through the bullets, but ultimately what this is meant to illustrate is that, as Jeff mentioned in the introduction, this is a new concept that has taken root both at the state and local levels nationwide at this point. And although these or I won't call it a program, these policies are relatively new, there has been some study of, in particular, local minimum wages and especially high level or high quantity minimum wage changes, meaning we're no longer talking about $7.25 to $7.50 at the federal level. We're talking about a jump from $14 to $18 or $18 to $25. In reality, the results of the studies that exist to date are fairly positive. They note not only increased wages for workers, very few job cuts, if none at all, and the idea that poverty rates are declining, all kinds of positive elements that I would say potentially override the fear of this is just going to be an overwhelming bad for everybody. So just a few examples here, and obviously there's more and more to come because this is a continuing to grow region of research. Next slide, please. So I know that's a lot to stomach and there's a lot of information there, but in an overarching conclusion, I'll focus on the self-sufficiency wage of $25 by 2030. And essentially what our analysis suggests is that 25% of all workers in Broomfield would be considered directly or potentially affected at this $25 level. It has the largest number of occupations affected, so 73 versus only 4 specific to restaurants under the status quo. The increase in earnings as of 2030 would be nearly 46% higher than that $17 state level minimum wage. And the job losses are fairly negligible, less than 10% under that $25 scenario. So that's all I got here. Sorry, next slide, please. I'm gonna punt it back to Chris.
Thank you, Christina. So I would just stress for the group, studies like this are not for the faint of heart. I think Christina and the team, the goal is not to do a study for the sake of the study, but to actually drive policy. So with that, I think, again, target and timeline. Part of the policy questions is, do you have flexibility? You get to make choices to think about when this unfolds, how it unfolds. And that, as you can tell from the study, has an impact on the economy. You're going to be giving the economy an actual economic nudge. So thinking about how that plays out and how long that plays out become important to the study. We spent a lot of time in the last few weeks talking about state law on tipped wages. It adds complexity to the conversation. So that's something that we're just acknowledging because it complicates the math basically, but it is a manageable thing to think about. And that third and most importantly, we acknowledge that Broomfield is different from Denver. So there is a need to get to some engagement to differentiate restaurants versus retail, and within restaurants, thinking about mom and pop versus regional chain versus national chain. They're all going to have different implications. And I think that outreach, again, we know when we ask the restaurateurs and the retailers, they won't like this. But by the same token, getting that engagement to understand real impacts and real risks. Again, if we think about it from a business retention standpoint, that outreach is always important. We would be doing it anyways. So again, what are those impacts? And that's something that we're certainly in a position to lay out what that structure might look like. And with that, questions, comments?
Thank you both very much. Give it
Next
back
slide,
to
please.
Mr.
Just-
Romine.
And Mayor, I just wanted to kind of wrap up. So as you saw, and next slide, please. As you saw, there's various conclusions. Obviously, the impacts to the workers, generally speaking, are going to be going to non-residents because of the way that Broomfield's economy works. At the same time, we see, as you pointed out, the effects of less demand on certain kinds of public policy or public programs. The other part was, and this is always important to keep in mind, is what is going around us. And so one of the things that Chris and Christina have pointed out and talked about is what's going on in the immediate communities besides. So making Broomfield a community of choice for employers and for workers. And so that's part of what this is, thinking about the context of our neighboring communities. And so finally, I just wanted to end with, obviously, we're looking for council direction on the next steps as a staff. What needs to be done, if anything. So the information is there for you. And then finally, if there is next steps, to think about the implications. And I put up the direct costs that we would expect for the engagement, some other things. Those are our estimates. The other part of course, is Broomfield is the largest employer in the city and county of Broomfield as an employer. And so there would be indirect costs or direct costs to the budget also as this moves forward. So at that, I conclude our comments in the presentation. Our consultants are here to answer questions of council. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Romine, and to our guests from AECom. Seeing it's almost 8 o'clock, I think we should go ahead and take our 10-minute recess now and come back and start with council member questions and comments. I hope that's okay. 7:53, we'll be back at 8:03. Thanks. Hi. And we're back. We were just starting council questions and comments on the living wage memo. So I will go to my colleagues and Bruce, Councilmember Leslie.
Thank you, Mayor.
Uh-huh.
First, I just want to indicate that this morning at the Chamber of Commerce meeting, the director, Pat, requested that should we go forward with this study, that the chamber would like to be involved. And so I said that I would share that with my colleagues on the council. In terms of question, to what extent does Broomfield, in order to be competitive to attract a workforce, maintain a competitive salary structure regardless of the minimum wage?
Mayor, Pro Tem council members, and I'll start and perhaps, I don't know if Christine wants to add a little bit to it. As many people know, as you drive down the street, you'll see signs all over the place that say $17.50 hiring now, $17 and things like that. So many of our businesses are already matching or far exceeding the state minimum wage. And that's anecdotal information. As we look at the difficulty that we have is most of the data that we receive, other than the right now the QCW data, which is the unemployment data that's right now being questioned at the state level. Most of it is really more on resident side. So our residents get paid significantly more and they work all over the metropolitan area. So it's a little difficult to say in talking to, and I'll just finish with this and then turn it over to our colleagues from AECOM. Many of in talking with our businesses that tend to hire people of moderate wage, they tend to also be talking about housing as an issue as well as the wage level. So it's difficult to say that it's the transportation issue or it's the housing issue or it's the wage issue, but all three of those combined, that it caused employers at the mall and in other areas to necessarily have to solve some of those issues. And oftentimes the way they do it, since they can't control the other two, is by providing higher level wages.
Jeff, I'll just add one thing really quickly. It is about the data, right? It's very difficult to understand business by business what they're offering in the current market, which I think is why the outreach and engagement becomes extremely important. Those are data points that would be really valuable from that process of getting a sense of where the current levels are by business type. And then from there, being able to further understand, refine our analysis, because that assumes that we're doing it on the basis of workers' wages, not business offered wages. And the reality is, if there's a significant number of companies that are already above that threshold, that's already accounted for in the data that we use. So it'd be an interesting point to bring up in the surveys.
Former employer myself, I mean, we were constantly evaluated the marketplace as we structured all levels of wages. I was at academia, so we had low wage individuals as well as fairly high wage individuals, faculty, senior administrators or whatever. But for the low wage, we were constantly having to monitor that in order to be able to attract the workforce that we needed. So my assumption is that, and given the scope of the Front Range, we're all looking at each other, and industry is engaging with competitors in the same marketplace, that the wage issue would be addressed more by the competitive structure of our communities rather than the minimum wage itself. So anyway, from that perspective, my perception would be not to go forward, with this study. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you all for the presentation. It was very, very thorough. I guess I just have a couple questions to start off with. In determining the livable wage scenario, I think it was $25 was what the presentation determined. How did you come up with that particular number? Because MIT's livable wage calculator currently has one adult, no children like myself at 2863?
So it's a great question. The various calculators and reports do have different methodology, so I don't know directly off the top of my head how MIT differs from the Colorado state level self-sufficiency study. But to answer your first question, the $25 level was using the the 2022 value from that report. That report's only updated every 5 years, if I'm not mistaken. And escalating it for inflation through 2030, which we're using a fixed 3% inflation assumption. So the exact math would be 2022 value escalated at 3% for 5 years or 8 years, excuse me.
Okay, I was just curious because went through and did a calculation of my expenses versus my income, and technically I'm in the red. Technically, if I wasn't in school taking out student loans to cover things. So that was my first question. My second question, in the reduction of the number of people or the job reductions, the percentage that you mentioned, is there a way to calculate of those jobs, how many are occupied by people who are taking on multiple jobs in order to make ends meet?
Maybe is the quick answer. I'd have to think through. The quick answer with this analysis would be no, right? The data that we have was strictly at an occupational level across the wage distribution. So there was no consideration for multi-job holders, any type of demographics. We would either have to attempt to impose demographic information on the occupation level wage data, or pivot to a completely different data set with roots in those demographic elements, which is a much more time intensive process to get to the same results.
And I would say instinctively, the premise of the higher wage would mean that you might see a job loss, but that could mean one person working 2 jobs instead of 3.
Yeah. And I assume the answer for my next question is the same as the one you just gave me in terms of, how many of these jobs are being occupied by people under the age of 18 who either do or do not necessarily have to work in order to provide for family members, for example.
Yeah, that's correct in that we don't have the transparency to add that demographic element, but it begs a really interesting question about the Broomfield market in general. I would have to come back with concrete numbers. I don't want to spew anything, but I think there are far fewer teenage minimum wage. I'm in high school scooping ice cream to pay for gas for my car. The reality is more so that they're taking on unpaid or maybe paid internships, things that might progress their career-oriented future plans rather than just taking a minimum wage job for pocket money, so to speak. And again, I don't have numbers offhand, but that's the impression that general demographic trends give for this area in particular.
Okay. A question for staff. How many of since we're the largest employer for the city and county of Broomfield, how many of our positions pay at or somewhere near the current state minimum wage? Do we know?
Mayor Pro Tem Council Member. So we actually have done a little bit of analysis. I don't recall off the top of my head. I'm looking at Jennifer, if she remembers.
Our seasonal are the only ones. And there are temporary, but it's hard because temporary could be 4 hours and it could be 20 hours. So it depends on how that markets out. But primarily it's for our seasonal and for our minors.
And what percentage of our positions are those jobs? Do you know?
No, but I'll know here in just a minute.
Okay.
And if I could just add to the city manager's comments or city and county manager's comments, and that is as you know, most of the seasonals come in during the summertime, where it's really those individuals and they're working 40 hours as an example. but that's the great bulk of it. We have about a year ago when all this began as a conversation, we began to think about what that impact might be to the city and county of Broomfield, but our data and our analysis was pretty premature at that point, so we don't have a necessary number if that's the next step. And your questioning is, what would the impact be on Broomfield? We don't know at this point.
Okay, thank you. I will say for Ward 2, we have a wide range of incomes because we have the Interlochen Business Park as well as every single hotel for the city and county of Broomfield resides in Ward 2. And our largest employer or I shouldn't say largest employer, our largest sales and use tax generator is the mall, resides in Ward 2. And I know the hotels and some of the workers at Flatiron Crossing Mall do commute great distances because they can't afford to live here. We have people that commute in from Brighton and Aurora. And so I think going through this study would be beneficial. And just in my personal opinion, I think we should be looking at more of that livable wage. Because regardless of what job you have, for whatever reason you're in that job, you deserve to make enough money to afford to live and not some minor amount of money just because we've decided that's how much we think you're worth. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a quick question to start off my questions. So you're looking for directions on whether or not to move forward with this right now, right? Because if we're not talking about specifics tonight, right? Is that my understanding?
Mayor Pro Tem, council members. At this point, we've done the first step, which was the analytic work that was requested by council in the focus session. If council wanted us to move forward in any particular manner, the next two steps that could be done at the same time, one would be a significant outreach activity. As mentioned, I think by the mayor at one point recently in a council meeting, I'm trying to remember, but said, please engage the chamber at the appropriate time if that's what's needed and other people in the business. The other part, quite frankly, that probably isn't, it's a little bit of a nuance, but is mentioned in the memo, and that is the implementation. These are difficult things to do. Also, how do you enforce it? And so those steps are something that we'd have to work, and it'd probably be involved both with the city attorney and her team as we began to think through that and talking to other communities and how they've done it. As an example, in Denver, the auditor actually enforces the minimum wages there, and that's a major undertaking, and therefore there are expenses related to that at the same time. So we have not gone anywhere in this. You'll note that we have not estimated either costs directly to Broomfield, to the businesses, nor to what the enforcement would look like. So those would be the next steps if council directs us to move forward in any manner.
Will that also include analysis of what our neighbors are doing? So or other communities?
We do know what the other neighbors are doing. The Adams County study, actually, because I'm a reader on it, was asked to look at it. They are preparing to have that study finalized soon. And so we'll be seeing the Adams County study. So at least on two of our sides, they are considering it, or in the case of Boulder County, they've already implemented it both at the community level and the county level.
Boulder County did theirs. But the local municipalities are also doing.
The local municipalities are beginning to implement municipality by municipality, and I believe Boulder, you recall, didn't Boulder implement theirs, if I recall?
Unincorporated Boulder County did, but the city of Boulder, Lafayette, Erie, Longmont, and Lafayette are all on hold.
Okay.
Boulder, no.
City of Boulder implemented it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Taylor was who, yeah. They haven't implemented, but it just went into effect.
Yeah, January 1st.
January 1st.
Okay. And so if we do move forward, what is the timeline for us to, as far as implementation, I mean, going through those steps, estimated implementation, recommendation?
I feel like such a dream killer tonight. Something's coming off. This is a huge lift. It's not saying that it's not an important lift, but it's an expensive, big lift.
So realistically, I mean, given that it's already almost March, realistically, we're talking at the earliest of a January 1st, 2027 start date? If we've picked up first of the year? Is that kind of what you're thinking?
No, we're not thinking anything yet. We're going to wait until your direction goes.
Sure. Okay. And then a couple of just logistical questions. You mentioned in the presentation about potential, can we do something different for small businesses, restaurants, mom and pop? Are we able under the state law to be able to do a different schedule for?
And let me just reference this just because this is important. As you may know, may or may not know, state legislature is considering and starting to contemplate the tipped wage issue. That has been one of the fundamental difficult issues that's being faced in Denver and everywhere else, is thinking around that. So those are the types of ways that you can impact individual firms and try to think about different classes of people. But generally speaking, at least in Denver and most other cases, when you apply a minimum wage, you apply a minimum wage. And that's just the realities of how it kind of rolls through in Colorado. And
I have friends in DC that own a restaurant, and they went through the process a couple years ago about doing away with the tip wage. And these people are probably some of the most progressive people that I know. And they, as restaurant owners, they definitely wanted to keep the tip wage. So I know that's something the state controls. And then one other question I had that was kind of reference to other questions. Are we allowed under state law to do a training wage, a different wage for people under 18? I know some states do that.
I'm looking at Nancy because I don't know, but I know when we were working through these things in Denver, and this is 5 years ago, plus when I was still there, we were contemplating a couple of those kinds of things, and we unfortunately were not able to do that. Now, the state law was passed after we began that work, and so maybe there's been some modification, but I would defer to the city attorney's office. The other part that we did, and I'll just reference since you brought this up, is both for the youth and/or training wage. The training wage also oftentimes includes IDD individuals and others, and oftentimes those folks also have to be paid the same minimum wage. It's just the requirements of it. And so those types of things are some of those implementation questions that we would have to really explore because they are very detailed and we want to make sure we get them right. So that would be part of the conversation that we'd want to have with the city attorney.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Marshall, I can answer that. The state law actually prohibits that type of different pay, and it says all adults and minors, no matter how they're working, need to be paid at least that minimum wage.
Gotcha. Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay. Then I guess my direction, I'm going to echo everything Councilmember Ward said a minute ago. I think that it is absolutely worthwhile endeavor to go forward with. I understand that it's a big lift, and I understand that it will be a process we have to go through, but we have to, I mean, to echo Mayor Castrado a minute ago, we have significant programs for those making less than 60% AMI, and that cost our budget money. And if those individuals were making more, that would be off of our books. And I think there is just a dignity that is deserved in working. You should be able to live. And so I support moving forward with this, and I support moving forward with it at the livable wage level. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Wynn.
Thank you, Mayor. So in general, I guess the principle is, so actually, let me take a step back. Boulder, Denver, they're raising their wages. And currently, the city county of Broomfield does not have a set wage. Wouldn't it make sense that prices would go up either way for costs, groceries around us, just because the salaries of folks living in Boulder and Denver are going to go up, and that's going to probably cause a feedback effect of sorts?
So I think it's
difficult to easily project what will play out. I think we're at a moment right now where costs, labor costs, material costs for restaurants and retail are beginning to normalize. So again, we're sort of weaning the excesses of the last 5 years out of the system. There is a reality that cities like Denver are going to be higher cost by default. Again, I think about, big cities, of course, there's a certain reality of higher costs. So I think as we head to sort of official post-COVID, 2025, 2026 and on, the way I would probably frame it to say is there's an opportunity to strategically evaluate minimum wage to make sure that you're appropriately positioned relative to other cities. Because at the end of the day, from a restaurateur standpoint, if you're getting a higher caliber of employee, if you're paying them more money, that's not a bad thing for a restaurateur. But being sensitive that not all restaurateurs will benefit equally and not all retailers will benefit equally. And that's why the engagement piece is helpful in clarifying those real impacts.
And this isn't really a question. It's more of a statement. Like I've read that the restaurant industry in Denver has been destroyed. Like you're seeing 50% of restaurants close. And I guess my question then is, that is a con I've heard before, is that tips, livable wages, that is going to be difficult for restaurants to burden, so to speak. So I guess my question to you folks, because you're the economic guys here, I'm just the public administration person over here, but how can that be addressed? And is this something that would be applicable to Broomfield?
What I will highlight is actually fairly recently, and we can probably share the link, there was an interesting article about Denver's restaurant industry in particular to say that it's very difficult to pin all of Denver's troubles on their minimum wage changes. They have some complicated permitting in the city of Denver. They have a stigma around homelessness that has been addressed and is being addressed, but that makes it difficult for people to frequent restaurants in the downtown area. And I think the other thing that they brought up pretty heavily was the traffic considerations due to construction, where restaurants are just being completely blocked from access because of different road construction and otherwise. So with that, I find it really difficult to point a finger strictly at minimum wage, which is not to say that it's not partially to blame, but just that there's a much bigger picture there that can be easy to overlook when you're looking at everything through the lens of strictly minimum wages. As far as how Broomfield might address it, it's obviously a very different market from Denver, so it would take that additional consideration that I think the business outreach would be integral in understanding what they might see as the roadblocks, or what other, even from a community standpoint, what community members find as challenges to accessing restaurants or things of that nature. There's more to be considered that we don't have the data currently to address.
That was a great answer. And I appreciate that. And my last question is, in 2020, 2030, that's in 5 years, believe it or not. And I think that in our city and county, we're going to expect hopefully not a significant population boost, but this is a growing city. And I guess my question then is, if we do increase the wages here, and assuming, this council has been pretty productive with affordable housing and approving units, what if our population increases? Would this affect, our growth of the community?
So what I would simply say, I think the good news from a retail standpoint is that we are no longer having a conversation about the retail apocalypse. So these markets have calmed down. I think fundamentally we're at this age now where retail is going to be driven by rooftops. So part of the interesting dilemma here in this calculation is that as the community continues to grow, you're going to be creating demand for more retail. So that factor does come into play, because there will be more retail sales, more demand, and therefore you're feeding into a growing market as opposed to a stagnant or stable market.
Yeah. And I wish we had a crystal ball to see what the market looks like. So with that said, and those questions answered, I think I am going to give my guidance is that I think we should go ahead with this initiative, just because I believe that, Broomfield is going to have to face this, not dilemma, but this reality that folks are going to want a living wage, or a wage that is able to prosper here. And I think like not that I'm having a crystal ball, but the general sense I'm getting is that Boulder, Denver, large municipalities are going to be having those wages set. And obviously the federal minimum wage has not increased over and over 10 plus years. And we got to do something in the local level. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Delgadillo.
Thank you, Mayor. A handful of questions. So the first, when I was looking at slide 18 in the presentation, I was wondering if you have like an aggregate EV calculation for essentially, so we saw some jobs might be destroyed, right? Some jobs might be gained, but then the increase in wages on average, does that amount to an aggregate gain in wealth for people who are working here and average loss? I mean, it looks like the numbers point towards gain, but I was wondering if we had that number offhand.
I wouldn't have a specific number. I think in reality, what this reflects is, let's assume under that self-sufficiency scenario, you expect 7% losses over that 5-year period. What that's stating is that 93% of affected workers are still reaping positive benefits. So the 93 is the kicker there, and what that threshold might be, is it a 95.5? Is it a 98.2? What level of losses are you willing to tolerate for how much upside for those that don't necessarily lose their job is part of the implementation consideration and things of that nature. So.
Okay, that's helpful to conceptualize. And then I think Councilmember Ward made a really apt comment about how really maybe going from 3 jobs to make ends meet down to 2 might actually be a net benefit for folks. And I mean, our GDP, our economy, what is counted in the economy doesn't count things like time with family and time spent around and doing that sort of thing, which is very much productive work as far as I'm concerned. But because you can't put a price on it, it's not part of GDP. It's not part of anything like that. So that makes sense. And then another question, my second question was, what are some unique factors you found when looking at Broomfield specifically? And I think the one that came to mind, which I think you somewhat alluded to, which I thought was interesting, but maybe not fully, is that Broomfield's a very affluent area on average. And so I would assume that for a lot of people, they're a little less price sensitive than say in the Denver area or some areas where you actually do have a wider diversity of incomes and affluence here. So I was wondering if that is anything we had data on. I'm assuming the data are pretty sparse in this area, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
To get something like that to be Broomfield specific, it would need to be surveyed to a certain extent. You'd have to ask the questions both of businesses and consumers. If there is some buffer room where profit margins are high for restaurants and retail in that regard, and customers have deeper pockets and are able to stomach price changes that only chip into profit margins for businesses, then that could in fact be the case. But I think the reality or a parallel reality in Broomfield is the commuter element of the workforce. Over 90% of low-wage workers do not live in Broomfield. So there's this struggle of you're increasing the wages, but they're not necessarily taking that money and spending it in Broomfield because they're going to drive it home and go to their grocery stores and their restaurants and things of that nature. So the equity component is a consideration that can't be overlooked.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's very helpful. I guess I'll kind of jump into my thoughts. First of all, I'm kind of joking. I heard your presentation and I was like, someone is not Chicago School of Economics affiliated. It was my first, sorry. That was why I got my undergrad degree in economics is from there. So, and I was, that is my shame I bear for the rest of my life. But that was the first thing I thought when I heard your presentation, which I thought was very lovely, by the way. So, and then in all seriousness, though, I guess with my opinions, I really do think that we should move forward with this. I understand that this is a huge lift, but it seems like it would be so impactful for the people living in this area and around here, even if they're not Broomfield residents. I mean, people are people and we need to treat them with equity. I'd also like to point out that if any of these residents are maybe coming from this area, I think Ward 2 has the highest chance of them being from there. So Ward 2, the ward that Councilmember Ward and I represent, has the lowest AMI in Broomfield. It's much less affluent compared to the other wards, and folks certainly who live around here, many of them I'm sure are cost burdened. And then one more thing that not to put words in anyone's mouth, because I don't think this was being implied by any of my council colleagues, but I do want to just point out that not every 18-year-old or younger is really living an idyllic childhood. A lot of folks are working to support their families and are working because they have to. And so I think regardless of whether you're 17 or 18 or older, you should get paid fairly for the value that you bring. So I'm fully in favor of this. I understand it's a list, but I also think that this is such a high impact thing we can do that we should move forward with it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Councilmember Cohen, who has his posted up, and then you, Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you, Mayor. I had a couple questions just from the presentation and the answers given so far. I think the impetus for this was it a year ago, was that there was regional efforts afoot, or so it seemed, from both sides. So if to our west, they've postponed and it's still pending, but you have an insight into the Adams County approach. I don't know if Westminster is part of the Adams County approach, no, or Thornton, which seemed more impactful of our own retail. What's your sense of, in the years since, why they've slowed down their movement toward this?
Mayor Pro Tem, council members, I think part of it is politics and policy. And I think part of what everyone is trying to understand is what are the impacts and how are they going to be felt? And with the earliness, truly earliness from an economic perspective of what the impacts are going to be and how they work out in Denver and Edgewater, which are the two that have really implemented it. I think that's part of what's causing the concerns in Boulder County or in the communities of Boulder County. And I can't speculate of where Adams County is as far as what the commissioners are going to want to do or what each of those individual communities are going to do. So you are correct. Part of Westminster is in Jefferson County, part of Westminster is in Adams County. So how each of those communities will go through, that is my understanding of the way that they have been looking at it, and correct me, City County Manager, but I think what they did when they did their study is look at it as a whole, but not necessarily that they're all going to move forward together necessarily. That's the way I understood their study and what the commissioners had asked their staff to look at. So I wish I could, I just can't answer why they may slow down or not,
Okay.
or speed up.
My sense is they may slow down simply because of the chaotic national environment, that Adams County will be affected dramatically by a number of executive orders and other policies that are coming out that may give them pause. I had a couple things you said I wanted to ask about. Notably, I think it's like over 80% of the people who work in Broomfield live outside Broomfield. So a minimum wage increase would probably benefit people who live outside Broomfield more. But do we know how many people actually commute into Broomfield for a minimum wage job? I would assume it's a small percent.
And again, the belief is, and I think that's what has been shared by my colleagues from AECOM, is somewhere around 90% of the people that are coming in for those types of jobs are coming in from outside the community.
For minimum wage.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so they may be coming from Adams County or Weld County or even Boulder County in some senses because of the student population. Many, there are students living in Ward 2 as an example that may be looking for that additional income to make the difference between what the tuition is and where they have to get. So you know, every individual family and worker has their own story, and that's part of what the engagement does. It just as it does for the businesses.
I was just curious about cause and effect that, you know, if we raise the wage, would people live in Broomfield? Because we, like, as Councilmember Delgadillo mentioned, it's very expensive to live here. So that's maybe one reason they don't. They just come here for the job and it's worth them to come for a minimum wage job, I guess. I had another quick question in terms of, you mentioned enforcement was a lift. How is the current minimum wage enforced?
So
if an increase of a minimum wage is a lift?
The state of Colorado obviously administers their minimum wage. But in the case of Denver, as an example, in that case, then the auditor happens to be enforcing it in Denver, not the state of Colorado. So many of you pay attention to Denver or sometimes get the auditor's newsletters and other things. Every quarter comes out and says how many people he has helped bring their wages up to the right levels or whatever it was. So it's something he reports it. It's the auditor himself and his office in Denver that's enforcing it, not the state of Colorado.
Okay. And quickly, in terms of economic strategy, you know, to the point that Broomfield is a expensive place to live. I don't know much about Edgewater and how it compares. In terms of whether it has more lower income minimum wage jobs, more hotels, more restaurants, and more of a community that's impacted by minimum wage than Broomfield. We don't have a lot of hotels and things of that nature, but is there something from your economist point of view that it's perhaps better for us to spend time attracting higher wage jobs, businesses that pay higher wage jobs, and things that make it possible to live in Broomfield rather than, you mean would focus on minimum wage hurt that effort?
As the ACOM study points out, there are both positive and negatives, the teeter-totter, the seesaw, the balance beam, or not balance beam, but the balance. Each of those have impacts in different ways. And so, as I pointed out in an earlier question, people that are impacted by wage levels that are at the more moderate level tend to also have transportation issues and housing issues and childcare issues. And so no one individual thing stands alone and is going to solve it. It tends to be how it all comes together from that standpoint. And that's what the Colorado Self-Sufficiency Index, I actually was part of the original one. I was a consultant on that, or a reviewer of that. And it's just the way that that study's been put together is to look at the holistic side of it. And I think when council had directed us at the focus session, you were looking at that sense of livability and self-sufficiency. So my answer to you is there are some economic things for sure, but there's also public policy items, and some of these the council's already addressed and began working on. Just the significant amount of effort and funds that you put into affordable housing has made a difference for, I think it's roughly, if I remember right, roughly about 400 or 500 households. So each one of these steps is important and how they fit together. No one thing solves the problem.
Right. Okay, thank you. Just to close, I guess I am somewhat reluctant to move forward, just simply because I think we agreed at the initial outset that this needed to be a regional effort, that going alone was not the wise course. And I'd really prefer to wait and see what Adams comes up with, whether I think they're going to be checking the political and economic climate very well. And I think we'll learn a lot from what they eventually report. And that probably will have impact on the Boulder area community residents as well, or communities as well. So I'm sort of in a hold. This is a really good report. I really appreciate your presentation. It gives us a really better sense of our employment market. And, oh, and I'm sorry, I did forget one question. I think you alluded to it, that right now there's sort of a lack of labor. So I think there's a demand for workers at this point that's probably driving wages up anyway at this point. But I'm in a hold and wait and see what Adam says before we decide whether to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Anderson.
Okay, thank you. This is a lot of good questions here, and most of mine have been answered, but I do have a few left. So Ward 4 has a substantial population, a retired population. And so I'm just wondering, I didn't see any information in here of the impact on the retired population. If you're seeing when you get that nudge in the economy and the prices go up, and yet we have people on fixed incomes who've recently retired or haven't retired, like they're not going to realize this increase in wages. Was that considered at all?
So I'll say this carefully. I think there's at least an interesting implication for people approaching retirement who their income is a function of they're mostly retired, so they can only earn a certain amount of money. And I was actually ironically walking on the street in Chicago where I heard someone actually talking about their concern about an increase in wage, limiting how many hours they would work. So that's a very specific insight from Chicago, but I thought it was telling in terms of what the impact could be on someone approaching retirement, working a retail job, but being mindful of they have a limited number of dollars they can earn in a year as they approach retirement before they take Social Security.
And that Social Security will remain fixed despite increased costs. That one bothers me.
Again, we didn't consider it specifically, but it's a detail.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. And then I heard that with the increase in wage, there's a benefit of higher productivity. But if that really is the case, this one kind of baffles me. Like if that really is the case, then why wouldn't employers just automatically pay more to get that increased productivity? Like how would you realize that with a minimum wage versus just? Yeah.
I think my argument to you would be there are, say, national chain retailers and restaurants that have already invested and have thought into the caliber of worker they're getting, and they have a much better grip on how a change in wage ultimately informs a change in sales. So they can do that calculus very quickly. They understand it. I think for some of the smaller mom and pop type stores, there's a lot more concern and trepidation over, okay, my costs have increased, but my market hasn't necessarily increased. So I think for the larger corporations, there's a cleaner understanding of the relationship. They can do the math quickly. For the smaller companies, again, it's more uncertainty and fear about what that consequence will be.
So that'd be assuming, so if it's for the national chains, the increase, you wouldn't necessarily realize that increased productivity with the increase in the wage.
I think they would be better positioned to understand the choice. And again, I think if I was a restaurateur, if I was a company, the upside of paying a higher wage is that you maybe get to give them more responsibility. So there's it's not just an increase in dollar, there could be an increase in responsibility as well. So there are trade-offs there.
Okay.
Just to chime in on the productivity front, it's probably one of the more difficult to define concepts in the economic literature as it pertains to minimum wage. Like, what is productivity? How do you measure it? Does it for McDonald's, is it that you flip 16 burgers an hour instead of 12? Or in a retail store, are you folding more t-shirts versus not? So that body of literature varies pretty widely in terms of how productivity is measured, which does make it a difficult thing to pin down, right? Like, how would a bigger versus a smaller employer necessarily visualize productivity? It's a little bit more of a theoretical concept than it is something that can be concretely and easily measured and has been measured in studies. So I know that's not a clean answer, but the reality is productivity is just a difficult concept to define, which makes those findings difficult to apply to a specific context, like a Broomfield or a Denver or a Boulder.
Well, thank you.
And if I could just add, I mean, now we're going to prove that there are 3 economists in the room. And so I apologize for this, but I would just add one thing, and I'll just remind everybody to go back in your Econ 101 class. And there's something called labor capital trade-off. What that means is the firms that Chris was talking about, oftentimes while they're both paying a little bit higher wage, they also can invest in technology. And so that increase in productivity may be a product of that. The wages are actually forcing the capital substitution, as we used to call it in Economics 101, which means they are going to produce more for every hour of labor. So part of what is happening here and what you're hearing from my colleagues at AECom is not everything can be simply measured. It's some things are so mixed together, it kind of gets lost. But I would suggest to you that's part of the reason why you see productivity rise is because of that ability to bring technology in, i.e. Scanning pads which you order on. All of a sudden, each employee is producing more because you're actually doing the ordering and scanning your credit card. And so it makes you more effective as an employee. So that's what's happening with productivity partially also.
And I suppose that could be part of the loss of those jobs where you have the automation. Okay, thank you. And then I think here's my hesitancy to move forward with this discussion at this time is that it's so complex and we know that. And we're not just talking about single individuals or a family of one. I mean, I'm a family, I have 5 children. Like we're so over the board. If raising the minimum wage would, lead us to allow anyone who wants to live in Broomfield can live in Broomfield, and we take away the need we could just do away with our inclusionary housing ordinance and everything became so simple and all these other programs went away, it would be great. I'd be all for it. But right now, what I'm hearing from staff is that this is a heavy lift. We're asking for a lot of things right now. And for as much as I would love to hear what the chamber has to say. I would love to hear what small business owners have to say. I would love to just see this conversation go forward, but it just doesn't feel like now is the time. Because ultimately, I think it's not going to be crystal clear. And I guess we stick with from my perspective, stick with the market-driven approach right now. And we know we have there's a lot of good paying jobs in Broomfield. So I will say to not move forward this conversation at this time, but I do appreciate all this information. Thank you.
Councilmember Henkel.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to our 3 economists in the room. I don't know if we can afford your minimum wage tonight, but do appreciate your work. And this has been a lot of information. It's something that we've been talking about as a region. So when I was chairing the Metro Area County Commissioners last year, it was constantly a point of I wouldn't say contention, but it was just sort of how can we work regionally on this? And that was always the talk. And I just sent something in an email to City Council, just showing what other people have done in the areas. I will say that even the counties have to work with their cities too. So that's one good thing about Broomfield. And I like the fact that we have to take in our own information and our own data. But we do still have to work as a region because if we have people driving to Broomfield, for the most part, they're driving from somewhere. And usually those somewheres are in the region. So I was always the kid that if my parents gave me options A, B, and C, I asked them for a little bit of Z and maybe a little M. So maybe it isn't so much gung ho at first. Maybe it's still doing more research of the area. But here's my thought on this is that if we're noting regionalism and Commissioner Levy out of Boulder is trying to work on cities working together to move in this direction, I believe that we have to learn how to track the same type of data too. We still have to be inclusive of what Broomfield needs. Because even our workforce is different in Broomfield. We're very, people call us the Silicon Valley of Colorado, right? We're the tech people, which is great. But also at the same time, we have these service workers in the area that also need to have equitable, pay. Would it help to use some of the data that other parts of the region have collected and at least help guide us to show them we are working as a region, but also noting that maybe we have a lot of metro districts, for instance, in Broomfield, very different than some other places. I don't know how different it is in Adams County, but I know the first thing that I thought of in our restaurants is that they would say, well, we have like multiple metro districts that we have to pay out. And those are going up like crazy. And so the businesses would probably push back on that because of our situation with our metro districts. So A, would we be able to track sort of the same data sets as Boulder County and Adams County? And maybe just sort of define what that data set might look like. And then B, could we incorporate some things that are unique to Broomfield? Because that's what we do anyway in a lot of our situations.
So members of council, Mayor Pro Tem, we are using the same data. We are just using it for Broomfield as opposed to Boulder, as opposed to Adams, which each of them are doing uniquely. And at this point, and it's true to our cousins to the south also, each market is uniquely different because of the characteristics of the market, both the composition of the types of firms, but also just how it interacts with the local communities. And so we're using the same data. It's consistent. It's a question of, is there a regional approach versus a localized approach? At this point, with Boulder County and then Boulder communities moving forward, the regionalism side of it may be not here as much as it may have been 2 years ago or 3 years ago, as those ideas were forming. Knowing a little bit about the Adams County, they are looking at it also a little bit differently because they're thinking about Aurora as an example, which is vastly different and a complete different marketplace economically and from a labor force than what we're talking about here in Broomfield with Boulder County. So that's the difficulty with doing this at a localized level, which is why sometimes it's been only done at the state level. You know, there's no right answer to that, but I can tell you the data is the same. How we're looking at it is very similar as presented by AECOM. It's following a very similar model they've done, but the conclusions are unique to Broomfield, and that's what we felt we were providing at council's direction. So we could think about it a little bit differently, but I would suggest to you that.
Okay. I will say that I believe from just in conversations with other county commissioners out of Boulder, that they also noted that those people who are of certain populations, or BIPOC populations or immigrant populations, are adversely affected by a minimum wage because that's generally where they start because they don't have a work history in the US. And it would be interesting to sort of look at those data sets as well, just to be consistent with other people. I would like to move forward with this. I'm not sure it has to be on, number one priority gung ho, but I do believe that we have to work as a region. I concur with Councilmember Leslie and just at least doing outreach in the way that we're reaching out to our businesses and what their thoughts are, if they've thought about it before, what their studies have shown. I will say that sometimes the studies, if they look at it, it's going to be a different filter. It just is, and it's going to be a different filter. That's one thing we looked at MAC. It's going to look different as a business owner, and it's going to look different as someone who might be an immigrant. But if we're honest with ourselves, I would say that I would like to move forward in a way that affects the timing of Boulder and Adams and working together and collecting the same data sets, realizing that we have our own data as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Lim.
I have two, I guess, more specific questions. On slide 12, what surprised me there was that there was a very slim margin, at least slimmer than I thought there would be, of potentially impacted workers. So there was a narrow band of workers that would be impacted by, who were just above that $25 threshold, that would be impacted by the elevation of the minimum wage. I thought it would be a wider band. That's at least from what I've heard, bantied about, is that there is a concern that there would be a wider band of salaries near that $25 level that would have to be raised than just that. I think you had 25 to 27 or something that would have to be raised.
Can you go back one more slide, please? This one, yeah. So you're right. The the idea or the definition of what constitutes a potentially affected worker from a dollar standpoint is not an agreed upon concept. It varies from study to study. In our case, this number was generated it is all workers making at or 15, sorry, I'm gonna butcher the explanation here, at or up to 15% of the proposed increase. So the 25, it's 25 to 2696 is I think how the math truly shakes out, but it's 25 plus 1.15 times the difference between the status quo wage and the $25 wage. So that's a predetermined assumption of this analysis, and it is not a set number. So it could be that it's wider, it could be that it's narrower, more narrow, excuse me. But in this particular study, we set it at that level for all intents and purposes.
Okay. Obviously that impact, that assumption there of who's the potentially affected then impacts, some of that job loss, analysis or, impact and all that kind of stuff.
Well, and it may also be that we're running into an issue where there's a certain salary level, there's a certain hourly rate where you're actually being paid a salary. So you're going to work 40 hours a week. Well, you might work more than 40, but you're getting a salary versus straight hourly. You might actually be working more than 40, be eligible for time and a half. So we're hitting a blurry edge where we're either shifting from an hourly position to a salary position. I think that's why, it's something it's a question, obviously, we have to think about.
Okay.
And I would say, I'm trying to think of where this would be. The jobs effects were strictly for directly affected workers. So the results that were shown were only the green portion. There are subsequent results that would impact the potentially affected. And now I'm wondering if my brain is, would you mind going forward? I don't know which slide. Keep going, like 5 or 7 slides. See where that gets us. This one. Okay, no, I'm sorry, scratch that. I should have looked first. This is cumulative for all directly and potentially affected workers. I apologize. But yes, these numbers would then change if ultimately the total affected workers grew because of the widening of the potentially affected band, then there could be different implications for the job changes.
Okay. The other thing that I didn't hear mentioned was, what's to prevent a business that has to raise minimum wage from cutting costs in benefits somehow? Like what if, they decrease, well, maybe they have no health benefit. I mean, it's possible they don't have any health benefit, or maybe if there was a health benefit for a close to minimum wage worker, that they cut the contribution or something like that for health benefits. So is there any data to say, do businesses that are forced to raise minimum wage end up cutting benefits in any way?
Well, I would say first that there's nothing to say that they couldn't, just because they change the minimum wage doesn't restrict them to only changing benefits to minimum wage workers. So there has been the suggestion that businesses should think about all the various possibilities of opportunities available to them to balance costs, one of which might be even potentially cutting benefits to non-minimum wage workers or shifting costs in some other way. There's very little quantitatively studied on that aspect at this point in time. So yes, it's possible, but do we know to what extent or quantitatively how that would affect? It would very much have to be a business by business study with some very, I would say, confidential data that it would be hard to come by.
Okay, my consideration is this 80% of Broomfield works outside of Broomfield and 80% of Broomfield workers come in from outside. And I understand the, we don't want to be too narcissistic here, but it is a factor. And I agree with Councilmember Cohen that I'd like to have a better feel for what the region does before we move forward with this. So thank you.
Right, thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Shav.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to staff and AECom for your work on this study and for the information that it contains and all the answers you've given tonight. I also want to thank Mayor and Council colleagues for pursuing the conversation around local minimum wage. A question for you: when we talk about the living wage of Broomfield, I think that of course, we have to acknowledge that 85% of Broomfield's workforce originates outside of Broomfield. And from the calculators around living wage, we can compare the cost of living in those areas where 85% of Broomfield's workforce is originating from, and Broomfield's living wage, and to better understand that regional landscape. I was surprised with this data that how different the Denver living wage was compared to Boulder and Broomfield's. That Boulder and Broomfield's were actually much more similar than Broomfield and Boulder. When I look around the surrounding areas, they are not as drastically different. We have Jefferson County to the south of us. They are closer to that living wage of Broomfield. And then when we look at Douglas County, again, closer to that Jefferson County, Broomfield, Boulder living wage. When we look to the east, we see that Adams County is much more similar to Denver. And so, I would love to get your information, your thoughts on this of, when we look at the self-sufficiency wage around that compared to that living wage within that region, how different are these different counties and the municipalities that make up these areas? Are we talking the difference between Broomfield and Denver, or are we talking that there's more outliers that would be lower living wage than Denver?
So the sort of tactical response is we came up with an approach that was specific to Broomfield. We didn't necessarily have the scope to go through this broader effort of thinking in more quantifiable ways about what's the defendable view on living wage. I think it's fundamentally a policy question that the city can look at in terms of what your ultimate view on that living wage should be. Obviously, we could conceivably update the study if there was a choice on a different living wage. That could conceivably happen if that was important. But I think at minimum, we wanted to come up with a framework that was structured and logical that would allow us to understand the choices so that we could get to a policy conversation. So it could be revisited, but I think the framework that we gave you was such that it provides a certain amount of clarity on what we think the issues are. But
so Mayor Pro Tem, Mayor and council members, so when they did the self-sufficiency study, using that as the example, they look at it from a perspective of cost as opposed to a perspective of income. The other part of it that you always have to remember is they're not looking at the overall cost for, we'll say, a median household. They're actually looking at the more low and moderate income individuals. So they're thinking about the costs that those people face. As pointed out by a couple of your colleagues, those people oftentimes are working 2 jobs or a job and a half or those other things. So when you look at that study that's been done by the University of Washington, I think now for close to 20 years, it may be even beyond that now that I think about it, but it's really focused on a different metric. It's not the middle income people that we oftentimes see and think about when you see a lot of the other demographic information. This is very much, Denver as an example has a significant population of low and moderate income individuals, as does Adams County, as does other parts of the region. Comparatively speaking, Boulder has some, and I don't mean to minimize that, but it's the same types of thing as you probably have read about the points and time counts and other things around homeless. The distribution is not equal for that portion of the population by each of these counties. And so that's really what the self-sufficiency index is looking at. And we used that as the reference point because it's the most generally accepted number right now in the metropolitan area. And so that's why we use that particular thing in their study.
Thank you for that. So my thoughts on this are, we've been told our budget is stable yet fragile. We've viewed the budget through a lens of critical obligation and mandates. This program would not fall into one of those buckets. It would fall into that fourth other bucket category. I think that we have to consider what else is in that other bucket. What are those programs that are already in there for 2025, and what doesn't get done if we are to move forward with this. The costs associated with program, even just the initial outreach and communication, as our staff has told us in the memo, is not included in the 2025 budget. We've heard tonight that this is a significant and costly program, even just these next steps, which I do think are very important steps for us to go through. So if we move forward with this program this year, we have to consider what doesn't get done this year. We just saw a budgeted impact of something that wasn't budgeted, and we just approved that to move forward. We're going to have another conversation next. And this doesn't just apply to those current programs that we have, but also future requests in 2025. So we have more. I'm sure that other council members have other ideas of what else they would like to see happen in 2025. And so by moving this forward tonight, we say to those future things, those aren't going to happen. We have to. This is a big undertaking for us. This isn't just one small thing that one department is doing. This is what our organization is going to be doing. So in the years past, we've expanded enhanced Broomfield programs. We have continued and enhanced initiatives associated with oil and gas, sustainability, transportation, housing. In 2024, 2025, we've seen unexpected expenses associated with the former Safeway building, First Bank Center, affordable housing projects. So again, we have to decide what financial and staffing resources are reallocated to this effort instead of doing something else in 2025. That for me is a hang up. I do believe in local minimum wage. I've studied it a lot and to see the impact that this is going to have and where we are in the national and the state conversations regarding budgets and budget cuts. People are going to feel those the loss of those programs or the minimization of those programs in a big way. And so this to have this conversation makes it very meaningful. But I have to stress that what are we not going to do in 2025 so that this program can move forward? That's my hang up for me. That's all I have now, Mayor. Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Does anyone have any other follow-up questions? That seems to be another tie. And I concur with Mayor Pro Tem. Everything he said, I agree with. And this is something that I've worked toward, for a couple of years, but given what is facing us and the uncertainty, I don't think it's a wise move to move forward at this time.
Thank you, Mayor, and
Thank
thanks,
you all
Council.
so much. I learned a lot, and it was good to do this deep dive. I appreciate all of the work that went into it and my colleagues' efforts, but I do have to agree with Mayor. Thank you. All right. Our final item this evening is a discussion regarding best value contracting. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, and I'll ask our staff to begin the discussion.
Thank you, Mayor. And coming up, I don't have, it's David. Somebody Yates is coming. Deputy Director of Finance. And I think Graham is also here, Graham Clark. And our two procurement specialists are here to add to the conversation as well.
Thank you, Manager Hoffman. Mayor Pro Tem, council members. My name is David Acevedo Yates, Deputy Director of Finance. First, I want to start off by thanking our procurement staff for their work on this topic and also just their continued work with guiding Broomfield through its procurement processes and practices. As stated tonight, I'll be presenting on best value contracting. Next slide, please. As a review, council directed staff at the 2024 focus session to research and report back on to council on values-based preferred procurement and Broomfield's current practices. Tonight, I will be reviewing best value contracting, including how Broomfield's current practices align with best practice. I'll also be covering values-based procurement practices, and finally, we will be seeking input from council on moving forward. Next slide, please. Broomfield's current practices and processes are codified in Broomfield Municipal Code. When we operationalize the direction from Municipal Code, we use as guides the American Bar Association Model Procurement Code, the National Association of State Procurement Officials, and federal acquisition regulations. As it relates to current Broomfield practices, FAR allows for assessments during the solicitation process to include more than just cost. So we're looking at a wide range of criteria and value that Broomfield would gain from contracting. Next slide, please. Over the years, Broomfield staff has taken guidance from those general sources I mentioned and has focused on creating a repeatable, standardized process that fits within best practice. This is to ensure transparency, fairness, equity, and integrity in the process. Our process involves multiple participants to review solicitations, which includes staff from the departments procuring the goods or services, along with procurement staff guiding departments through the entire process. In solicitations, we generally focus on two types of procurement: lowest cost method and request for proposal. For lowest cost method, which is typically used during invitations to bid, we have a specific set of requirements for the goods or services we're procuring. And we generally know the pricing and the quantities involved. The focus here in the lowest cost method is in creating a fair cost comparison between vendors. In general, we're looking at and comparing the responsive and responsible bidders on the proposed cost that they submit. Requests for proposals, or RFPs, are generally for situations where the project is complex or could be accomplished using different approaches. RFPs allow us to negotiate the costs and determine best fit with the project. We can compare vendors based on actual costs, opportunity costs, cost savings or cost avoidance, and tangible and intangible benefits. Next slide, please. Here's just a general overview of the procurement process as it currently stands in Broomfield. We divide the process by the estimated cost of the goods or services. So on the left side, you'll see two routes that are for $50,000 or less. We focus these vendors through their quotes that they submit to us. For example, our custodial division recently obtained 14 quotes for window washing services for multi-level facilities. So that's a lot of quotes that we go through and we compare the costs for that project. The estimated cost for that project was under $50,000, and so we used the documented quotes as the basis for our decision on which vendor to continue on with. Above $50,000 on the right-hand side here is where we do more of an in-depth analysis on the goods or services that we're procuring. So in these cases, our procurement team meets with the departments, and our procurement team functions as an unbiased party in the procurement process. So the procurement team works with the departments to identify the needs of the project and also the best method for procurement. The procurement team will also work with the department on determining the appropriate evaluation criteria based on the project needs, and they'll also organize the evaluation process. Next slide, please. So that was just a quick overview of a really complex and in-depth process that we go through. Next, I'll talk about how values-based procurement practices look and what they would look like for Broomfield. So while staff does not recommend a values-based procurement approach to be incorporated in Broomfield, we have researched what the process could look like. And what we have found is the first essential step is to complete a disparity study. This study is conducted by a contracted third party that demonstrates the need for such practices. And in the case of legal challenges from vendors, can provide a legal foundation for such practices if we had to defend those through a legal means. We also found categories that are typically used. These would include woman-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, small business, veteran-owned business, local preference, sustainability practices, and living or prevailing wage, as we recently discussed. Next slide, please. So the procurement staff did research these practices from other organizations. We met with representatives from the City of Boulder, City and County of Denver, and the Colorado State Architect's Office. What we found is the City of Boulder, the City and County of Denver, and Colorado State offices do have requirements on prevailing wage. They do define specific and limited cases where prevailing wage is required as part of the contracting. For example, City of Boulder limits the prevailing wage requirement to custodial, landscaping, tree services, carpet installation, and snow removal services. So any procurements that involve those services would fall under the requirement for prevailing wage. In addition, they also have dedicated staff to perform audits at regular intervals on the contractors to ensure compliance with the prevailing wage requirements. Additionally, the City and County of Denver has created a method to ensure that disadvantaged businesses are prioritized in the solicitations process through what they call defined procurement pools. Denver has approximately 1,400 certified businesses for various goods and services, and they first limit competition within those certified businesses. Next slide, please. So there are challenges that we found through our research. The first is the potential of creating restrictive and excessive requirements for projects. This can lead to unfair competition and even possibly inadvertent discriminatory practices. As previously mentioned, the necessity to complete a disparity study before implementation of these types of changes does create a cost burden. As example, the City of Aurora allocated approximately $500,000 for a disparity study. The City and County of Boulder jointly allocated about $634,000 for their disparity study. These disparity studies are completed about every 5 years. As you heard at the 2025 focus session, Broomfield has not budgeted for additional projects such as a disparity study. And with limited financial resources available, we would need to delay or cancel other critical projects to make the necessary resources available. Another challenge is the need of increased staff time to monitor compliance and enforcement of these requirements. We currently do not have the staff capacity to implement values-based preferred procurement practices and would require a significant number of new employees to ensure appropriate management of the process. We can also expect delays in the procurement process caused by increased time needed to develop and review the solicitations, and potentially the occurrence of procurement delays caused by limited competition. As an example, the City and County of Denver, as I mentioned, uses those defined procurement pools. So they first limit the competition to vendors within that pool. If the solicitation has to remain open for those vendors in that select group. But if the solicitation fails for many reasons, what can happen is Denver then has to cancel the solicitation and then repost it open to all vendors. So that causes a time delay in completing and finalizing the procurement for a project. Next slide, please. So after reviewing our current practices and what values-based preferred procurement practices entail, it is the staff's recommendation that there is currently no need to shift from our current practices and processes. We have a very comprehensive and rigorous process. The staff continuously monitors best practice to help guide the organization. For example, the procurement staff is currently completing an extensive review of Broomfield's policy manual, procurement policy manual, which is a review that we go through every few years. At this time, staff does seek council's input on either a shift to values-based procurement, which would require a disparity study as previously mentioned, or that we continue current practices around best value contracting as they stand for Broomfield. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. And we're here for questions and discussions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Acevedo Yates. We'll go to council questions and comments next. Mayor Pro Tem Shav.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mayor. So I've gotten almost last, I think, with the last two items, so I figured I'd go first with this one. So going 3 for 3 with no's tonight, let's not do this. Thanks, Mayor.
Oh, wow. Thanks for that brevity. Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess I have a question about I'm trying to figure out how I want to phrase this. It relates to the disparity study. Is the disparity study required if you want to implement any one of those potential categories, or could we, instead of going all in on the categories of, women, minority, veteran-owned, local, sustainable, et cetera, could you only pick one that, say, let's just say living and prevailing wage, because we just had that conversation. Could you implement that without the need for a disparity study and reasonably incorporate it into what we currently do with our practices?
Thank you for the question, council member. So the disparity study is considered best practice, and you do not have to have a disparity study for all of the different categories. You can choose which categories you would include in the disparity study. I would say that it would be highly recommended that we do the disparity study, because as mentioned in sort of the presentation, there is a potential for vendors who would not meet whatever requirement that we have entered, so a living wage requirement. Right, there is potential for legal challenges to the validity of us having that requirement. So the disparity study would prove the need to close that gap. And so if we went and had to, argue, for having that requirement, it sort of allows us to have that foundation of the proof that we need that practice. Hopefully that answers.
Okay, let me rephrase the question then. Would we need a disparity study to, instead of saying we require this, but use it as part of a scoring mechanism that you all currently, if I understood the memo correctly, currently use this scoring methodology of different issues, with including cost, time, et cetera? Could you use that as a factor to score instead of just making it a blanket requirement and not need a disparity study for that added scaling points?
We'd have to do more sort of research on the legal aspects of just using it to score. What I will say, and to that point, is using it to score, we would still have a requirement of ensuring that the vendors who have submitted a proposal stating that they are meeting the living wage or prevailing wage requirement, we would still need to have staff available to monitor the compliance of that. And you would have that, again, as the legal aspect of vendors just submitting bids saying that they're meeting that requirement or getting the points for meeting that requirement, and then not actually meeting that requirement. So we would still need staff to monitor and ensure that vendors who are submitting those proposals after we've contracted with them are actually meeting the requirements that would have granted them the points for that.
Okay. Thank you.
That it?
I don't think I have any other questions at this time. I was trying to rattle my brain to see if I could find one, but I don't think so right now.
Yeah, we can always come back to you. Councilmember Cohen had his flag up. That's what you need.
Is that what it is? Thank you, Mayor. Couple of quick questions, if I understood. The follow on the question on disparity studies. If it's best practice for procurement, do we have a regular scheduled disparity study?
We currently do not, since we don't have any of those values-based requirements as part of our current process. So we wouldn't need a disparity study at this time.
So if you looked at what the other communities were doing in terms of their disparity studies and decided we didn't need one, what were the indicators? Is it the type of work we're seeking, the type of contractors where they're coming? How do we say, well, we don't need that, we're good?
It's the type of requirements and the evaluation criteria that we're using. So we're not using, at the moment, we're not using any criteria that would constitute a sort of values-based preferred procurement practice. The criteria we use, while it does vary, we are looking at we're looking at the experience of the vendor. We're looking at the types of work that they've done previously, if they've done it on the scale that we are requiring, and those sorts of things. So those don't, there is no disparity in terms of, of the vendors in that sense. So we don't require the disparity study.
In that vein, to quote a former defense secretary, we don't know what we don't know. Is there any reason that we should check ourselves every so often routinely to make sure our existing procurement, maybe not just on this standard, but is functioning correctly and not inadvertently discriminating or favoring anybody in particular?
I would say at this point, we haven't had any vendors complain about feeling that the processes are unfair or that the practices are unfair, and feeling that, that the evaluation criteria that we've used has created any sort of inequity in the competition.
That was one other question I had, is what prompted the other communities to do this? Is it typically complaints that brings us to this?
I think it's based on the fact that they are looking at advancing criteria that would qualify for the need for a disparity study. So again, women-owned, minority-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses. The disparity study is meant to show that vendors that are competing for your contracts are being sort of disadvantaged based on the criteria that you're seeking to evaluate on.
So the good news to report is we don't have complaints, correct?
Right.
Okay. And one last question, and these communities aren't necessarily good peers. Are there any peer cities to Broomfield, cities and counties, but these communities of our size who do this type of procurement, or would we be definitely an outlier in that sense?
I'd say some of our peer communities are moving in that direction, but they haven't gone through a disparity study. So I would say we wouldn't quite be an outlier, but we would be moving. We'd probably be like first movers if we joined some of those peer communities.
If they're moving in that direction because of complaints, is that the main driving factor?
No, again, I would say it's mostly through the council, their respective council, their respective bodies moving towards criteria that would qualify for the disparity study.
Okay. And one last thing, which isn't related to you, but I just caught my ear, was Boulder makes a specific carve out for carpet installers. And just having someone who's had carpet and hardwoods installed, they should add hardwood installers. Because those people work 10 times as hard as carpet, nothing against carpet installers, but I felt guilty watching the hardwood installers, how hard they're worked. It was a 4-day job they did in 3 days. So if we ever go that direction, keep that in mind.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Marshall Holston.
Mayor, one legal question for Attorney Rogers, actually. Going off Councilmember Ward's question on if we were just to add the livable wage to the criteria of our existing criteria, do you know of other communities that have had that challenge, and have any of those challenges been successful?
Do not know that off
Okay.
the top of my head.
It seems to me that the livable wage it's a policy decision. It's not, I mean, as opposed to, like, for example, the minority or whatever in business. I understand the need for disparity study for those purposes. And while I think all of those categories are important, I don't necessarily think that they're appropriate for Broomfield right now. So I do think that we can move forward with the livable wage, for example, without a disparity study and be safe, in my opinion. Obviously, Attorney Rogers could speak otherwise at a future date. But I understand the reasons that have been mentioned as to why this is not right for Broomfield right now. But I'm going to hit on 2 reasons why I believe it is. One is 2 specific things. I appreciate you putting all this work into this and the different categories, the minority, the local. Those are all important things. But the 2 areas where I think that are important for our community is sustainability and livable wage. We obviously just talked about livable wage at length, so I don't really have to go into all of that. I'm just going to say that most of us up here, when we ran for office, we were endorsed by labor groups. Many of us supported and worked for or didn't shop at King Soopers this last few weeks because of the strike. We as a council have decided to set the policy to pay Broomfield employees at a wage that leads the market. I believe that it is, respectfully, it is hypocritical not to expect those that we contract with to also pay livable wage. I think that we owe it to our community to pay the people that would do work for us at a livable rate. So that's the one that I feel the most strongest about. And the sustainability one is important to me also because this council, and I'm pretty sure it was unanimous, it enacted our greenhouse gas reduction goals several years ago. And if you look at the memo from earlier today, our diversion rate, our greenhouse gas reduction goal is way below what we set out as a goal. It is sad, honestly, is where we're at. And we've taken baby steps to reach that goal. The trash hauling is an important one. And I do believe that adding sustainability practices to the procurement process it's a step. It's not just talk. It's a step that I do believe that we should be doing. This council put that direction forward when we were going forward with the trash haul. We wanted sustainability in the RFP. And I think that was an important step, and that's why I do believe this is necessary. As I said, I do think that all of the categories you listed are great, and I would understand that why we would need a disparity study for all of those. But I think sustainability and livable wage are the 2 that I think we could and should do now, and that's what I think we should do. So, thank you, Mayor.
All right, thank you. Next is Heidi, Councilmember Henkel.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to keep this pretty short. My daughter has a 5 a.m. swim practice tomorrow morning, and I usually have to leave by 9:45. I wanted to thank you for this and also thank Councilmember Marshall Holston for bringing this forward. This is something that a lot of us want to do. It might not be the right time, I don't think, this year, but I do think it's something that we should circle back for the same reasons as Councilmember Marshall Holston said. I will say that if we do that, it should probably also coincide with our minimum wage, talks as well. So I would like to see those work concurrently, but not this year. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And Councilmember Lim.
As much as I concur with Councilmember Marsh Holshin that sustainability should be a top priority in Broomfield, I do not think that this should go forward at this time. I would be concerned. This would take the staff resources of those who are deeply involved in the ERP process, and we are anxiously awaiting that integration into our city. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Councilmember Wynn.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate the presentation and I understand that staff and, y'all have been working diligently to talk about why this is important to not to change, but I'm still a proponent of, changing things for sustainability, equity, inclusion, and, I understand that some of these changes might cost a lot, but these are important values that we should stick and, principles that I believe in that, not everything is perfect. And at the end of the day, I just want to make sure that Broomfield is efficient and also sustainable. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Delgadillo.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll throw in my 2 cents, which is the big sticking point for me is the livable wage and adding that as a criteria. I think that's an issue of good governance. We want to do business with people where if we are engaged in a project, there is a lower probability that people will be turning over in the middle of that project. So I do see that one as uniquely different and like the ESG spectrum. The G spectrum is really what every business should be aiming for. But I think we're very much outnumbered here, but I'll add my 2 cents. Thank you.
Is that a yes? Okay, just I wasn't sure. Thank you. Councilmember Leslie.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. No.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Ward. Oh, sorry, Councilmember Anderson. My apologies.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I'll just quickly share that I think our focus needs to remain on where it has been: cost, past performance, technical capabilities, quality. Those are the key factors that we're looking for. Sustainability is a huge priority to me, but that's driven by factors outside the RFP. Those are other choices that we're making. There's a component there, but it's really the choices that we're making and what we're moving forward. I recall a discussion at one point in time about the types of jobs that we that are included in an RFP, and some of these, they're not, a lot of these are not low income jobs. These are skilled labor. Is that not true? I mean, how often would you be looking at current minimum wage type jobs as part of the work through an RFP that the city would bring forward?
It would vary. The projects that we do are pretty wide spanning. Obviously, a lot of the construction projects that we have would qualify under this RFP process just because of the cost of the projects that we're working on. But something like the ERP is going to be like highly skilled labor with the vendor, so it would vary greatly.
Yeah, and obviously my direction is to not move forward with this at this time, but I appreciate actually just understanding the procurement process better. So it was very helpful. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And now back to you, Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Mayor. I have one other question and then I will give you my direction that you have so
Waiting with bated
anxiously,
breath, yes.
anxiously been waiting. Mr. Acevedo, I want to go back to the point you made about the livable wage aspect and how you would monitor whether that's being adhered to. Any project that we undertake, let's just say deconstruction of the First Bank Center, does staff receive through that project manager, I assume, reports like progress reports and amounts paid out, et cetera, on a routine basis?
So yes, we do receive progress reports that would include some of the costs that are outgoing on that. I think, I guess Yeah, the
Okay.
answer would be yes.
The reason I asked that, and I'm trying to understand why this would be a big lift for staff to ascertain whether someone is following a livable wage standard for their employees. If we just require that as part of those routine reports, that a submission of a pay stub or whatever the methodology used to verify wages to employers or employees is given, and then someone, and I don't know if it's the project manager, if it's finance or whoever, would just go over that really quickly. I probably am making it more simple than it actually is, which still boggles my mind, but
Graham
it's a
Clark,
question.
Finance Director. Thank you, Mr. Ward, for the question, Councilmember Ward. We do get pay apps and we get progress reports, but what we don't get is payroll and timekeeping. It'd be very similar to a federal grant where they have to check Davis-Bacon requirements. It would be very much where you have to get every single pay stub from anybody that worked on site. We have to look at that, monitor it, audit that, and it is very time consuming. So you can't just look at certain parts of it, and you really have to look at all of it in its totality of the project, which includes all the subcontractors as well. So on a big project, there might be the main contractor, general contractor, and then you've got all the subs. And so you're talking about hundreds of pay timesheets and pay stubs and looking at all that and making sure that you're auditing that. So it very much is extra staff to do that. So yeah, similar to what you said, it's not as easy as just, it's similar to a federal grant, which is a lot of additional work.
Okay, thank you. Knowing that this probably has already lost, I'm still going to say I support putting in the sustainability and livable wage or prevailing wage factors as a scoring, part of the scoring rubric. I would support that, but I do know that this side has lost, so.
You were vote counting. Well, not really votes, polling. So yes, good. Well, you did, well, in case I had to break a tie. Well, I don't have to break a tie. The consensus is not to move forward and to stay with our best value contracting process that we already have. So thank you again for giving us the information we needed to make the decision.
Thank you.
Appreciate y'all. All right, well, that concludes the agenda items for this evening's study session. Is there any other business to come before the council from my colleagues or staff? There being no further business, the study session is